Hey guys, I'm Blango Schleem here at the Mafuti Club, and recently a big Half-Life 2 update and documentary dropped. And if you're huffing copium like me and many other Half-Life fans, Half-Life 3 might just be on the way. So in order to capitalize on this trend, I thought I'd make some content on Halo 3.
They let me pick. Did I ever tell you that?
In this video, I'll be playing through the entirety of Halo 3 and talking about my thoughts on the game, some of the lore, and some of my likes and gripes with it, and maybe some fun or silly unrelated things. And if you haven't already yet, I recommend playing through it yourself first. Since I'll be showing and talking about the entirety of the game, you will get spoiled. But if you don't really care about the series and just want to stick around and hang out, that's cool too. Thanks so much for even clicking on this video in the first place.
Can you guess? Luck. Was I wrong?
This playthrough will be on heroic difficulty and with 2 skulls. If you don't know what a skull in Halo is, in most cases it's basically a sort of difficulty modifier, which changes certain aspects of the game, making it more difficult in some areas or just outright making it more silly. This gives the player different options to choose from to make their playthrough a little more spicy and a little more fun in different avenues. In this case, I'll be using the Iron Skull. What the Iron Skull does is that it makes it so that if the player dies in any given level, they must restart from the very beginning of that level, basically making checkpoints irrelevant. In comparison to a lot of other first-person shooters of its era, Halo has some pretty long levels, about 20 to 30 minutes generally for the average player. The Iron Skull will make for some pretty sweaty moments given the length most of these levels are. However, there will be one point in this playthrough where I'll be dismissing the Iron Skull, mostly due to BS I encounter.
Radio for Vito. Heavy lift gear. We're not leaving him here.
Yeah, you're not.
Oh, crazy fool. Why do you always jump? One of these days, you're gonna land on something as stubborn as you are. And I don't do bits and pieces.
I will also be turning on the IWHBYD skull, which stands for the I Would Have Been Your Daddy skull. And no, that's not a joke, that's actually what it stands for. This skull doesn't really affect gameplay in any way, it just makes it so that non-player characters have a higher chance of saying rare and funny dialogue lines. And if you're wondering why on God's green earth this skull is named I Would Have Been Your Daddy, it's just a reference to some dialogue spoken by a character in Halo 1, as well as a level with that same name. The continuation of the I Would Have Been Your Daddy line is, but a dog beat me over the fence. It's funny knowing that the devs at Bungie were immature enough to put that line in the game, while also being talented enough to make such a great game. Unfortunately, you won't get much mileage out of the skull since I'll be talking over most NPC dialogue, but it's still a silly little option box I'll be ticking for fun. In short, this playthrough will basically be a vanilla heroic playthrough but with no deaths, a few deaths, and hopefully some funny dialogue lines. You might be wondering why exactly I chose to start with Halo 3 and not Halo 1, or Halo Reach, the very first game chronologically speaking, or even Halo 2 for that matter, which some people might argue is the best game in the franchise. And if we're talking story-wise, I would most certainly agree with that. So then, why Halo 3 and not any of the others? Well, part of it is because of nostalgia. There's definitely no doubt about that. Halo 3 is my favorite game in the franchise, and as a result, I'm very biased towards the game. I want to get that out of the way first. But I also think that Halo 3 has the best sandbox, and by extension, the best gameplay in the series. Additionally, I also think it's the most aesthetically pleasing game in the franchise, so I automatically associate Halo 3 with the face of the franchise. In other words, when I think of Master Chief, Cortana, Arbiter, or whoever else, and any other iconic imagery related to Halo for that matter, like the assault rifle, I instinctively think of Halo 3's versions of those things. I suppose it's all up to taste though. For example, some people who like Halo 1 the best might only think of that game's version of Chief and all that jazz. What matters for this video though is that I like Halo 3 the best, and that's why I chose this one to play out of all the other games. Halo 3 came out for the Xbox 360 in 2007. I was in elementary school when this game first came out. I did have access to Halo 1 and 2 at my cousin's house, but Halo 3 was my first real experience with the series, since it was the first one I actually owned myself and played through myself. I was so enamored with this game when it came out, man, and to some extent I still kind of am. It's just a great game. The graphics are beautiful, it's vibrant and still holds up very well today. It runs well even on some low-end hardware. The gunplay is extremely satisfying. The enemy types are varied, the AI is fun to fight, the story's good, the music's mesmerizing. I can't think of any crazy bugs, and yeah. It's finished, it's polished, it's just the works. It's a complete package, and it resonates very soundly with me. Before I get into it, I just wanted to talk about some interesting trivia here. Apparently Hideo Kojima, the guy behind the Metal Gear games, watched one of his henchmen or something play this game. He watched the guy walk through some foliage like what you saw those Marines do earlier and examined how the plants would kind of deform and compress and move aside in reaction to the players and NPCs. He apparently just nodded and walked away after he saw that. If you played some of the Metal Gear games, you'd know how obsessed Mr. Kojima is with technology and obscure hidden details he'd put into his games. Kinda funny if you ask me. Anyways, just a silly tidbit. In Halo, you can only carry 2 main weapons at a time. This 2-weapon limit might sound quite bad for Halo, especially if you compare it to some other FPSs like Quake or Half-Life, which lets you carry basically an entire armory at all times, allowing you to swap between all your weapons on the fly with no restrictions on use besides ammunition. If you told me that Half-Life has more complex gameplay than Halo because you have access to more weapons at all times, I might be inclined to agree, but it's never that simple. To write Halo off as an uber-casual normie experience just because you can only have 2 guns at a time is a little hasty, because there's much more to Halo's combat than just that. Of course, an uber-casual normie experience does sound harsh, but it also bears some truth. After all, Halo popularized a very simplified FPS control scheme, and later games featured some really aggressive bullet magnetism and an egregious amount of reticle magnetism. Plus, at the highest level of play, games like Quake are extremely technically demanding, allowing for things like bunny hopping and rocket jumping and whatnot. Technically, you can rocket jump in Halo, or grenade jump, or even brute shot jump, and you can even crouch jump on some uneven terrain to give you some extra momentum, but the campaign wasn't designed around these techniques. You'd more likely see this in multiplayer games, where gamer gods would utilize those movement techniques to style on noobs. Anyways, bullet magnetism, reticle magnetism, and a lower emphasis on positioning and movement, when combined, can really lower the skill floor, as pinpoint accuracy isn't such a big deal at all in these games. It allows for a big amount of leeway, and anyone who's never played a shooter before can pick up Halo 3 and perform just fine. Hence why Halo can be seen as a normie magnet. But this isn't such a bad thing at all in my opinion. Just because you don't have to aim as well doesn't mean that there's no room for skill expression at all. A tremendous amount of skill is still required at the highest level of competitive play, and there are things like map jumps and resource management and whatnot, which you'd also find in other arena shooters like Quake. If you type in Mint Blitz on YouTube and see some of the shit that guy pulls off, you'll know what I mean. And getting back to the point, there's much more to Halo than just its casualized approach to combat, more of which I'll touch on later.
Could you sacrifice me to complete your mission? Could you watch me die?
Back there, you were listening to the voice of Cortana. Even if you've never heard of Halo, you might have heard the name Cortana if you use a PC. Microsoft named their AI after this character, and if you know anything about using modern versions of Windows, you'd know that Microsoft is very fond of bombarding the average Windows user with their shovelware. But I also think it goes to show how influential the series was. The Halo IP is ultimately owned by Microsoft, so it makes sense that they'd reuse the name. But you'd think a gigantic corporate conglomerate like Microsoft would name their AI after some kind of highly focused tested name instead of a video game character. This is the battle rifle, my favorite weapon basically in all of Halo. It's extremely reliable at all ranges. Just a single headshot in its 3-round burst can insta-kill an unarmored, unshielded enemy. If you hover your crosshair over the heads of multiple enemies during each burst, you can theoretically kill 3 enemies per trigger pull, but that's difficult to pull off. And even without pulling that off, the weapon is still top tier in basically all situations. It's just an extremely powerful weapon. For that reason, I'll only be using the battle rifle primarily in the first couple levels, just to show it off, and maybe in some other missions if I'm really in a pinch. The sandbox in this game is just so varied and so diverse that it would be a shame if I spent half the game picking off enemies from afar with the battle rifle, so yeah, I'll be refraining from that when I can. If you've been paying attention to the gameplay here, you've seen that the player jump height is rather high. You don't really see this much in first-person shooters. You'd more so see this kind of jump height in platforming games like Mario, and I think it's really cool. Master Chief is canonically a genetically engineered superhuman with incredible strength and speed, and so jumping at this kind of height is kind of believable. So not only does it make for a fun gameplay mechanic, it also meshes well with the lore. The jump height makes it so that you can jump up and peek over cover, or just get a higher and more advantageous view of the battlefield for a quick second every time you press the jump button. You'll see me use this extremely often. In this sequence of the level, the player has to traverse this heavily shaded jungle area. There's lots of geometry and verticality in this area, which hides the infamous jackal snipers. Jackal snipers are infamous for insta-killing the player, especially on higher difficulties like heroic and legendary. A single headshot will straight up kill Master Chief, and a single shot anywhere else on the body will completely deplete your shields. They're very formidable enemies if you don't know they're gonna ambush you, but they're easy enough to deal with if you have a precision weapon handy, and also some smart use of cover. That being said, they're outright nerve-wracking to fight in this particular playthrough, since one wrong move can spell my death, which also means I'll have to restart the entire level. Luckily, I get past them here, but I don't get so lucky some of the time. And if we're talking about difficulty, I think I read online somewhere that heroic difficulty is the intended experience for the Halo games. In Halo, if you don't count skulls that alter values in the enemy's favor, there are 4 different difficulties. There's easy, normal, heroic, and legendary. I can't confirm that Bungie intended for each of the games to be played on heroic, but I find that it's the perfect difficulty for me. I think that normal and easy are way too easy for me, and legendary is just absolutely unfair. This doesn't mean I'm trash, okay? I'm a gamer. I've beaten each of the 8 mainline Halo games on Legendary solo, so you can't call me a bitch. Legendary difficulty is just absolutely unbalanced and does not play to Halo's strengths, I'd say. In these games, there's something the community calls the Halo Dance, which is the playstyle Halo encourages of the player. Essentially, what the Halo Dance boils down to is that it encourages the player to take more risks than most other shooters of its era. In games like Gears of War, GTA, or Call of Duty, players have to hide behind cover and tactically pop in and out playing whack-a-mole with enemies. Because if you stay out in the open and run up close to enemies, you'll just die very, very quickly. I'm not saying it's bad game design, because it meshes well with those games' much more grounded and more realistic settings. But in Halo, you play as a 1-ton, heavy-ass super soldier walking-ass tank. Your moveset and recharging shields should reflect that. And so both that and the tools in the sandbox encourage you to sort of run and gun like an unstoppable Rambo-esque soldier. Cowardly hiding behind cover in firefights is necessary for some encounters, but doing so for almost every single battle really hurts that power fantasy and that Halo dance, which is something that Legendary difficulty unfortunately detracts from. Halo 3 is slightly different since it's on the easier side compared to the other games, but it still ultimately falls into the trap each of the other games do. Enemies do so much damage in Legendary that standing out in the open for more than a couple seconds just means death. And on top of that, the TTK, or time to kill, is higher on average than most other shooters, which means that stronger enemies take a lot of sustained fire in order to kill them. And you can't rely on most friendly NPCs to tank some of the aggro either, since they do so little damage, and since enemies do so much damage, they'll just destroy your allies very, very quickly. So aside from invincible NPCs like the Arbiter or Johnson, you're just stuck with walking glass cannons, but without the cannon part, so just glass rubber bands, I guess. After they walk into enemy fire and get killed super fast, the enemies have no choice but to focus their extremely strong fire onto you. All of this combined makes for a very frustrating experience. You can't walk out into the open, since you die so fast, and you can't sustain fire on enemies that take a lot of bullets to kill, since you can't walk out in the open. This means that in order to reliably clear out rooms of enemies, you have to do things that are kind of immersion shattering, or just not fun in my opinion. Really, your only option to win engagements without taking absurd amounts of damage is to pick them off from afar with precision weapons, or much more slowly and painstakingly whittle down their health with much more inaccurate weapons from a distance, where enemies can't aggro onto you and shoot you all that much. And to make that method worse, some enemies are so tanky and have recharging shields, so you'll likely run out of precision weapon ammo quickly, since you used most of it killing off the weaker enemies. This leaves you to backtrack to previous areas to find precision weapon ammo, or exploit some kind of unlimited ammo source like from a vehicle or something, neither of which are very satisfying in my opinion. Forcing the player to play only this specific playstyle is not good. There's also always the option of just glitching yourself out of bounds to outright skip the encounter altogether. Either way, it really doesn't play to Halo's strengths at all, and is in my opinion bad game design, when mechanics don't complement each other like that and force the players to exploit or skip things, rather than engaging with the content and the game itself. I used the word force a couple times back there. Force might not be the right word to use here. Legendary doesn't force you to exploit or skip things or conform to a specific playstyle. You can, technically, theoretically, get through all of Legendary via the normal way by just engaging with enemies how you would on the other difficulties, but the game also doesn't force you to find the nearest firearm and blow your brains out. So yeah, Legendary is just bullshit. It's just a load of poo. It's a problem, and it would especially be a problem if I tried to do a Legendary no-death run. I could call myself masochistic in some regards, but not when it comes to playing Halo. I think I'd overdose on blood pressure meds if I tried to do that. Anyways, heroic difficulty is just perfect for me because enemies are still formidable and do a lot of damage, but not enough just to wreck your shit within milliseconds, giving you room to perform the famous Halo dance. Halo's gameplay leans much more towards the boomer shooters of the old era like Doom and Wolfenstein and whatnot than it does toward the new, more tactical shooters, I'd say. That statement doesn't very accurately describe the position Halo's in, but I can't really find any other way to describe it since I can't think of many other games similar to Halo. It's not exactly a boomer shooter, and it's not exactly a tactical shooter. It straddles the line between the two, and I think it's very unique because of that. It tickles my exact fancy. I just absolutely adore the unique gameplay in these games. In this part coming up here, the player is tasked with assisting a friendly pelican with clearing out an LZ for pickup. This is one of the few times the game asks the player to defend a set area, rather than clear it and then move on to the next one right away after that. Assuming that this is a player's first playthrough of the game, defending a specific spot against waves of enemies can be a pretty intense and memorable experience, especially since what you've been doing so far is just going from area to area clearing out enemies. While I do think that defending this spot was a great choice to end the first level and give a small test of what the player has learned so far, I do think it leaves something to be desired. There just aren't enough enemies to really make it a tense experience, at least for me. It's just a small gripe I have with this part, and besides it ends with a big explosion, so I can't really complain too much. Also, this cutscene playing out right now gives me the opportunity to speak about the cutscenes in general. Even if we set aside the storytelling in Halo 2, which is fantastic by the way, the cutscenes in Halo 2 are on their own a vast improvement over Halo 1's. The direction of the cutscenes felt much more professional, and in line with how big-budget movies are made in comparison to its predecessor. If you took the beginning cutscene in Halo 1 and played it side by side with the opening cutscene in Halo 2, the difference becomes immediately apparent. Halo 1's cutscenes are great in their own right, but Halo 2 just puts much more emphasis on creating a more believable environment, since Halo 1 was such a huge unexpected success. Halo 3 continues this trend, and naturally, since Halo 3 launched on a newer generation of hardware, it took things up a notch in the graphics department. But despite its huge graphical upgrade, there is still a glaring holdover from the original Xbox era, and that is the way characters move their mouths. It seems that despite the huge leap in fidelity, the technology for the animation rig specifically for mouths hasn't improved enough to create a more believable looking speaking animation. Sometimes the mouth animations are perfectly serviceable, but at other times the animations really don't match with what words are being spoken at all. It's really not that big an issue, but it does break my immersion a bit whenever I see it, which is why I thought to mention it just now. This cutscene in particular also highlights the decrease in quality of the storytelling in comparison to Halo 2. That might be the wrong way to put it, but in my opinion, I think the storytelling in this game is just not as strong as Halo 2's. One of the multitude of reasons why I think that is that they recast certain characters for no good reason, or at least, they recast characters for no good reason publicly. I have a personal conspiracy on why that is, which I'll talk about later in the playthrough. Anyways, this character on screen right now conversing with Master Chief and the Arbiter is Miranda Keyes, a major character from Halo 2. She's the daughter of the famous Captain Jacob Keyes from Halo 1 and some of the books. In Halo 2, Miranda Keyes was played by Julie Benz, best known for her roles in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Dexter, and Hawaii Five-0. For some reason, they changed the voice actress for Halo 3 to Justice Bolding. A quick Google search about this shows that the reason they changed the voice actress was to give Miranda Keyes an accent. Personally, I can't really detect any accent other than your standard Midwestern American accent, but then again, I didn't grow up in mainland America, so maybe I'm just ignorant about this stuff. Anyways, I think this is just corporate speak for we didn't like her performance. I did some quick scouring around and found that a lot of people just don't like Julie Benz's line delivery in Halo 2. Apparently, people thought her line delivery was a bit robotic, and I can understand that, but if you ask me, her performance was just fine. Nothing incredible, but nothing bad enough that warrants a replacement voice actress in my opinion. Previously, I stated that I thought Halo 3's writing was weaker than Halo 2's. Here's one exhibit.
We're about to get hit.
All personnel,
They're wounded.
code Alpha
We're getting
1,
all of them
prepare
out.
for immediate evacuation.
I have to carry him myself.
Ma'am, squad leaders are requesting a rally point. Where should they go?
To war.
Yeah, on paper I can see how that line sounded cool in the writer's room and in the booth, but it just comes off as detached and a tiny bit cringeworthy to me. It doesn't really do anything to answer the Marine's question, and it also makes it seem like Miranda thinks she's the main character in a movie or something, which I think is kinda humorous. I made up a funny scenario in my head, which is a continuation of the scene where after Miranda says, "to war," all cool like, shortly after a pause, the camera cuts to that same Marine that asked her the question, and he just says, "I just need coordinates, ma'am." And then like directly after that, the cutscene where she chambers around in her Magnum, like the gameplay just starts and she just like stands there and continues the conversation. Like it just took out all the wind out of her cool sounding one-liner there, so it makes that last line in the cutscene like twice as pointless. The dialogue in Halo clearly takes inspiration after the classic 80s and 90s movies where characters are given these really cool and meaningful one-liners at the end of dramatic sequences to really tie scenes together. But this one I think is much too ham-fisted and should really have gone through some further examination and even a revision. Also, funny story, at some point in my life I was replaying this game around my dad and he happened to tune in at just the exact moment when Miranda said her silly line there. And after he heard it, I remember him mockingly repeating the line, "To war," and then he left. It's kind of funny. I remember feeling genuinely sad and embarrassed that out of all the beautiful Halo lines, he just so happened to pay attention to probably the single most shittiest contrived one. Also, he knows I absolutely adore the series, so he refrains from giving me too much shit about it. Here, I'm doing some light platforming to pick up a skull, one of the difficulty modifiers players have access to that I mentioned in the very beginning of the video. In the original standalone games, in order to even unlock the skulls, you need to have first physically found the skulls in-game. But since I'm playing on the Master Chief Collection, that isn't a requirement anymore, and players have access to it from the start. For me, the jury's still out on whether or not this is a good design decision. On one hand, I think it's great for players to have access to difficulty modifiers from the very start, especially for players like me who have already found them in the original game. It just saves us the hassle of having to find them all over again. But on the other hand, I'm not sure how I feel about 343 Studios undoing an experience which was there in the original games to begin with. I know it sounds like such a trivial matter, but I'm kind of a little bit passionate about video game preservation, and even tiny little things like finding skulls to unlock them in the menu is still important, I think. This is the second level in the game called Crow's Nest. In my opinion, one of the weaker levels in the game. This, I think, is due to the lack of varied areas, as you'll see soon. The entirety of the level takes place indoors in this old 20th century era human military base, as mentioned in some random Marines dialogue. And on top of that, there is a bit of backtracking that you have to do, walking back and forth between areas you've already been. This on its own isn't really that bad. It still contains interesting enemy encounters, so it's definitely still fun, just not as interesting as it could be if the player was given more areas to explore. In its defense, the areas in this level are varied, but there's only so much to explore in a single human base. If you recall, the first level we finished took place almost entirely in a jungle, but it transitioned to an old hydroelectric power plant. This is the type of refreshing change in scenery this level lacks. Just a small gripe though, nothing horrible. It just goes to show how good the gameplay loop in this game is. Even if you have a somewhat subpar, lackluster level, it's still fun to play through. In some attempts of this level before this one, I tried, emphasis on tried, to play this game with a keyboard and mouse. Believe me, you do not want to see me fumble around with the controls. But I promise you I'm not that bad with keyboard and mouse controls. It's just that I'm very rusty with keyboard and mouse controls. Also, it only lasted for this next section here. After I realized I was trash, I immediately went back to controller. Speaking of keyboard and mouse, this game feels excellent and silky smooth to play with those peripherals. So if you happen to be on the fence about playing any Halo games because they were made for consoles, do not fear, because the keyboard and mouse controls are great and fully customizable as well. It also might be an interesting playthrough if you're a returning player from the old days to see how the game plays with something you've never played the game with before. More options to play the game how you prefer are always great to have, It just makes it more accessible for old and new players alike. And the more people playing these great games, the better, I always say. Turrets in this game are interesting. If you don't count the shade turrets from Halo 1, manned turrets like this were first introduced in Halo 2. In Halo 2, they give the player an opportunity to deal tons of damage from a fixed position, with a barrage of uninterrupted and unlimited 50 cal bullets. They're really strong, but the trade-off for such an effective weapon is that you're a sitting duck. It's fun to use on lower difficulties, but on higher ones it's not at all a viable option since you will die basically instantly once enemies catch on to you, especially in Halo 2, hands down the most brutal game in the franchise. Bungie took their turret game a step further in Halo 3, not only including normal stationary turrets, but also giving you the option to rip it right off its tripod legs. Not only does this add to the power fantasy of being a superhuman soldier, but it also adds interesting gameplay implications. First, your movement speed is reduced by a significant amount, so options for maneuvering around enemy projectiles are limited. Second, turrets no longer have unlimited ammo and instead have a fixed amount of rounds. They can't be reloaded nor refilled, so once they're ripped off their legs, it's a one-time use. And on top of all of these limitations, you can no longer throw grenades or melee. These are heavy setbacks, but unlike dual wielding, the advantage of having a powerful minigun, which can shoot for a long time without reloading, is just huge. It's an excellent and worthwhile inclusion to the sandbox if you ask me. And also, you've probably seen it in the first level, but there are these weird sequences that pop up during downtime, where the field of view scales up by a ton and brief flashing images of Cortana shows up while she spouts some crazy person dialogue.
You have been called upon to serve.
If you saw a brief pause in the video there, I apologize for that. My controller was acting up, so I had to unplug it and plug it back in again. It turned out alright. Story implications aside for now, I'd like to take a moment to talk about how much I hate these fucking parts. These parts are, in my opinion, the worst parts of the game because it takes control away from the player during gameplay, just to shove a little dialogue down the player's throats. I'd be completely fine with these sequences if they didn't slow down your movement speed by like 50,000%. I just have a personal gripe against these types of sequences in video games, and thankfully it's not that big an issue in Halo. But by this time in gaming, developers were just shoving this kind of crap into every crevice they could find. AAA gaming was just oozing with these garbage walkie-talkie sequences where you're not allowed to do anything but listen to dialogue characters say to you. I think this trend can be traced back to the very influential Half-Life series, but I might be wrong about that. Feel free to correct me if I am. But anyways, if you're going to do that kind of shit, just make it a cutscene or something and give me the option to skip it. God, I hate this stuff. Sorry, I won't bring this up again. I know how annoying it is when someone brings up their gripes again and again, so I'll refrain from speaking about it again. But eventually, I'll bring up this kind of sequence again just to talk about the lore implications. And also, I was doing a little bit of shimmying back there in an attempt to land on the platform below just to show you another skull. I failed, so unfortunately you don't get to see that specific skull, but it's not really an issue at all. It doesn't change anything, it's just a fun thing I wanted to show you. Just a couple paragraphs ago, I mentioned the word sandbox. I also mentioned it a while back in the first level. You've probably heard that word come up in games discussions, like, oh, this is a fun sandbox game, or, oh, the sandbox in this game is cool. For Halo in particular, when you hear the word sandbox, it refers to each of the tools and objects which the player can use to manipulate values in the environment. This includes things like weapons, vehicles, equipment, non-player characters, and also physics objects like crates and other miscellaneous things. A much simpler way to think about it, and also the way I like to think about it, is to think about a sandbox in a playground, where kids make castles and other things. The box in this case would be the level, or the static space that the player is confined to and can't manipulate. For instance, the ground I'm walking on, or the walls I can't clip through without glitching. If that's the box, then the sand would be literally everything else the player can interact with. Halo Sandbox is unique, or at least the sandbox in the classic Halos are unique, because everything that isn't tied down is connected via a physics engine. If I throw a grenade into a small crowd of enemies, the enemies will obviously take damage and die, but that's not the end of that interaction. Enemies will ragdoll and fly several feet in the air based off of the origin of the grenade's explosion. Their weapons will drop and also act as physics objects, having the potential to also fly away in a given direction. If the enemies themselves also happen to drop some grenades, the initial explosion might cause a chain reaction, blowing up those grenades where they dropped, causing their own explosions to damage and alter values to those other objects in those specific radiuses or radii. And on top of that, if there are any other physics objects in the vicinity, like vehicles or crates or fusion coils, those will get knocked back a fair distance and also potentially explode, depending on whether or not they count as explodable objects. All of this makes for an incredibly fun and satisfying sandbox, knowing that a single input can create a chain reaction and manipulate the battlefield in more ways than one. It's something that I barely see in other games, even the Halo games itself. Halo 3 itself seems to have the most kinetic and chaotic sandbox in the series. The two previous games, you could tell, were building up to this, and then in Halo 3 the physics peaked. And then after Halo 3, each of the other games seemed to put less and less emphasis on physics. For some reason I cannot tell you. Maybe engineers were having too much trouble programming or whatever and thought it was too much of a hassle. And I get it, developing games is difficult, and implementing physics in a non-frustrating manner for players is probably way more difficult than we realize. Or maybe that might not even be the case. Maybe Bungie and 343 thought physics were too silly and wacky and video gamey, and shouldn't have been a core focus of the game. But either way, I really don't like the direction the later games took. I really would have liked it if the future games in the series put more emphasis on physics. Halo Infinite looked like it was going in the right direction, but it just wasn't enough for me. Speaking of physics, did you know that the physics engine used in Halo is the Havoc engine? I didn't even know there was such a thing. I didn't even know that you could use a physics engine within a game engine. In fact, I still don't know anything about games development. Anyways, the Havoc engine was and still is a very popular physics engine among the games industry. You can find the Havoc engine in games anywhere from Halo to Dark Souls. And apparently, a huge chunk of the CPU budget in the Souls games is dedicated to physics. I don't know much about this stuff, but I'm guessing that fabrics and capes attached to armor pieces and whatnot probably take a huge amount of resources to render correctly and interact with things like the wind and player movement. I'd imagine that fabrics are way more difficult to compute and render properly, and in Halo 3 I can't really think of many instances of fabrics swaying in the wind. That being said, since everything is tied to physics in Halo 3, it's still amazing how well the game performs. The Xbox 360 has very limited hardware, especially compared to today's technology. So it's a miracle Halo 3 even ran on that console. The devs must have been at the top of their game. Going back to the sandbox, since Halo 3's sandbox puts a lot of emphasis on physics, it can definitely make the gameplay very chaotic and very fun to play around in. However, I also think that can bring some drawbacks, believe it or not. With chaotic gameplay brings unpredictability, and unpredictability can result in the player dying in ways that couldn't have been expected. I actually have some funny examples of this that I'll show you in some of the later levels, but getting back to the point, to paint a picture of how random this game can be, enemies can throw grenades at me at random whenever they decide. That's all well and good, plenty of games do this. It's not that random, and I can also predict where it will explode and deal with it just by running somewhere else. What I can't predict is that exact same chain reaction I illustrated earlier, where one grenade might blow up others on the floor, or affect physics objects and sending them hurling towards me, potentially killing me. If you're going for a mostly no-death playthrough like me, it can make things very frustrating when a stray crate or something gets sent flying in your direction dealing damage to you, indirectly resulting in your death, or just outright killing you, directly resulting in your death. In fact, as I was recording attempts at completing this playthrough, I actually died a couple times to things outside my control. Of course, a huge number of games have varying degrees of RNG. This is nothing new, and RNG is a tool developers can utilize to keep players on their toes and to keep playthroughs of games from feeling too samey. Roguelikes, for example, can randomize anything from map layouts to enemy encounters, and Halo 3 itself makes use of RNG by sometimes upgrading the ranks of certain enemies. But where RNG quickly becomes an issue is that when that same RNG results in gameplay situations that the player can't possibly have foreseen and does not have the tools to deal with, a la a stray crate or a fusion coil barreling towards the player at incredibly high speeds, ending your run of the specific level you are playing. It's just an issue of how physics dependent this game is, but I think that the game benefits way more from its emphasis on physics than it garners negative gameplay implications. And if you really think about it, it only detracts from the experience if you are in the mindset that you want to perfect gameplay encounters and not die a single time. You can't perfect gameplay encounters in Halo 3 in the same way that you can in a game like Devil May Cry, for example. The battlefield is just way too dynamic, volatile, and unpredictable for that. But if you're just in for a casual experience, the game is super fun to dick around in and see how the world reacts to your inputs. While the topic of no-death runs is still fresh, I'd love to plug a YouTuber who made a video on how he judges video games through the lens of no-death runs. He makes a great point on why he thinks games should be designed with no-death runs in mind, but for the life of me I can't remember his YouTube handle. If I remember it, I'll definitely put it in the description. Of course, if you can think of the same guy based on the vague-ass information I gave, please feel free to comment on it. I'll update it or something. He's been on YouTube for a very long while now, so it's very likely some of you guys are fans of his. Anyways, not every game can be designed with no-death runs in mind, but I think it's a huge plus if it is. One of my favorite things to do in games is to do a no-death run just for fun. One of the most recent examples I can remember doing this in is in Baldur's Gate 3. In Baldur's Gate 3, the hardest difficulty in the game is called Honor Mode, and in that mode, if your party wipes, it's game over and you have to restart the entire game, not just that specific act which you happen to be on. On top of that, enemies have access to legendary actions, which essentially just means they have a wider and more stronger set of rules or moves they can perform. There's also the standard stuff of, enemies doing more damage to you while having a higher health pool. I think that having these sorts of challenges really can force the player to push past their limits and is also an excellent test of patience and knowledge of that game's mechanics. Also, the sense of accomplishment you get after the tension is released when completing such a difficult experience is so good, man.
On the double! Hell yeah! They don't stand a chance now! Advance on the double! Got aggro! Look at the little bastards run!
This level, Tsavo Highway, can highlight some unfortunate aspects of the game, particularly vehicle-based combat involving warthogs, especially if you're doing a solo run like I am. Vehicles in this game don't control the same way as it would on foot. This might sound obvious because you're controlling a vehicle and not the player character, but I think this can be taken a step further. Since Halo is so physics heavy, each turn you take at higher speeds has an extra amount of weight put into it, much like real life. So a poorly made turn at the wrong time can send you flying out of control and even overturn your vehicle, forcing you out of it to flip it back over so you can get back in the vehicle again. In order to reliably stay right side up on uneven terrain, you have to take extra care not to take such sharp turns at crucial moments, or speed over jagged geometry, or again you risk overturning your vehicle. This is fine, and I'd even say this makes for some fun gameplay, The problem is when you bring enemies and friendly AI into the mix. If you're playing in single player like I am, and if you're driving a Warthog like I am, there is no way to reliably deal damage to enemies while you're driving in the car, aside from ramming into enemies. But this in itself incurs risks since you will be getting close to enemies that have access to explosives, like grenades, brute shots, and other power weapons. That's a risk I can't afford to take in a playthrough like this where I'm going for no deaths. The only other way to deal good damage while using a vehicle like a Warthog is to get onto the gunner seat yourself and let the friendly AI drive. And asking friendly AI to drive is like asking your drunk friend to drive. It's not a good idea. Don't get me wrong, the fact that friendly AIs are able to help you by soaking up aggro and pathfind themselves toward the objective is awesome. But they're also, they're AI. They will make some questionable decisions like stop or slow down in the middle of enemy fire, crash into walls for no reason, or handle the vehicle poorly enough to flip it over, all of which can very possibly result in your death. None of these are anything any sane human player would do. So if letting the AI drive is not an option, then the other option is to let them man the gunner seat. This is the best option to take in my opinion, but there are still several reasons why this is still a problem. If the player mans the gunner seat, they are able to hold the trigger down or the left mouse button down indefinitely, dealing a steady stream of concentrated damage at all times. The player can reliably kill one enemy in a couple seconds and then immediately move on to the next enemy, all while still shooting unlimited bullets. But if the friendly AI is manning the gunner seat, they are programmed in a way that will only shoot for a couple seconds, stop, and then start again for a couple seconds. Halting your fire for no reason means that enemies will die much slower than they would if a player were shooting them. This means that enemies have more chances to fire at the player, which in turn means a higher probability of death. To add more fuel to this dumpster fire, friendly AI are really fragile and will die only after a couple of seconds of concentrated fire, like say from a ghost or a chopper or something, let alone hugely damaging projectiles like from a wraith. This leaves you basically with no way to defend yourself. Also, in addition to all of that crap, since this game is so physics-based, explosive enemy projectiles, and friendly ones too for that matter, like brute shots, grenades, or whatever, have a good shot at making your vehicle unstable and prone to flipping over, kicking you and the Marines out of the vehicle, basically making them sitting ducks, and their small arms fire don't do anything to enemy vehicles, so they're of no help in that regard either. Anyways, this little situation I find myself in here is really rare. All of the vehicles I could possibly board here have either blown up or have been set out of bounds by friendly AI. I'll speed this part of the video up just because all I'm doing is just walking very slowly towards the objective. Oh, and here's a good opportunity to show you another skull. I forget which skull exactly this one is since it's unmarked, but anyways, the skulls in this game are in some super obscure places, way off the beaten path. You could make an argument that you can stumble across a couple of them if you're curious enough to explore other parts in the level, but some of these skulls are just nuts to find, especially if it's your first time playing and setting off to find them blind and on your own. I can't imagine how many thousands of first-time players new to Halo must have had that same mindset. For example, to get the IWHBYD skull, or the I would have been your daddy skull, you have to literally, not figuratively, literally jump through hoops in a precise and specific order to get them. I'm quite certain your average player would have absolutely no idea most of these skulls even exist. Bungie for sure intended this to be a community kind of thing, where gamers would have had to work together in order to discover skulls in certain levels, or simply just tell one another where each of the skulls are located. Despite the no doubt good intention of the developers to encourage community discussion, I just don't think this kind of extremely obscure collectible is good game design if you're thinking big picture. It's one thing if the skulls were simply just Easter eggs and you could get some intrinsic kick out of finding the silly funny skulls. But in both the original and MCC versions of the game, but to a lesser extent MCC, these skulls aren't just Easter eggs, they're directly tied to certain other aspects of the game. For the original, in order to even unlock the difficulty modifiers in the menu, you have to find them physically in the first place. And for the MCC version, it's less of a problem, but still a problem, since finding these skulls are tied to achievements in both games. Some of the skulls are so hidden and so obscure that it's impossible to find them without looking up a guide online. And anytime this type of stuff comes up in a game, I automatically roll my eyes. Looking up a guide on a separate device, or even just alt-tabbing into a separate window if you're playing on PC, is completely immersion breaking and takes you out of the flow in my opinion. Anyways, it's only really a problem if you have completionist-esque tendencies like me. I suppose a solution for this particular problem I have with the game would be to make these collectibles a bit easier to find by giving it some kind of sound cue, or by having it show up on your motion tracker, or even hinting at it in some of the game's terminals. But I suppose that would have been outside Bungie's original intention of making it sort of a scavenger hunt for the community. There's a popular technique among some players where they would give Marines in the passenger seats some powerful weapons like fuel rod guns or rocket launchers. But in my opinion, my previous complaints about friendly AI still stands. Doing even that still doesn't do much to mitigate the randomness that comes with AI. And on top of that, like, the cherry on top of all that stuff is that the vehicles you man act as an extension to the player's hurt box. What I mean by that is that if the vehicle takes any bullet, not the player mind you, the vehicle takes any stray bullet like a single round of fire from a ghost or something, the player's shields will also get damaged. This means that if your windshield or one of the wheels or something or other gets shot, even if the bullet does not connect with the player directly, you will still take damage, adding time to your shield's recharge timer. On higher difficulties like Heroic and Legendary, your shields will deplete super fast even when attempting to try to get your Marines a good, clear shot of the enemy. This doesn't even include the vehicle's health itself. The vehicle itself has an invisible health bar too. So when driving a vehicle like a Warthog, if both the passenger seat and the gunner seat are full with Marines, you have to keep track of not 1, not 2, not 3 health bars, but 4 health bars if you want to reliably deal damage and have even a fighting chance at surviving and winning a single instance of vehicle-to-vehicle combat. A single instance, not a couple, a single instance. Marines don't have recharging health, so the health they are left with after a single battle is it. If they die, they can't be resurrected in any way, so if you're in the middle of a battlefield and your Marines die, you will be left offenseless unless you can find some other Marines lying around. So if I'm playing single player and have no friends, and I'm playing on Heroic or higher, and I have the Iron Skull on, what options do I have to consistently and reliably progress through vehicle sections without dying? As I see it, there are really only 2 options, neither of which mesh very well with the core gameplay. The first option is that you can kill or leave your Marines behind so that you're alone, stay way back in the battlefield where enemies can't aggro onto you, man the gunner turret, painstakingly aim your inaccurate fire at distant enemies and pick them off slowly one by one. The second option is to either glitch yourself out of bounds to skip enemy encounters or just straight up run through the intended path, not engaging in vehicle combat altogether. In my opinion, neither of these options are fun, but they're the necessary ones for this particular section in this particular playthrough. Since if I tried to do things the normal way, I most certainly would have died over and over and over, banging my head against the desk as I restart the entire level again, over and over and over. So for this upcoming section that's particularly rough, I'll just be jumping off the Warthog and going through on foot. If I weren't recording this playthrough, I would have preferred to go with the former rather than the latter option of picking off enemies from afar, since I don't really like leaving enemies alive in most games if I can help it. But I think that would be very, very boring for you to watch, so ultimately I just decided to go with the second option. Apologies if you were, for some reason, looking forward to more vehicle-on-vehicle combat, but it's just not a viable option to go with for this section, for Warthog specifically. But even though I do skip through this section, it doesn't mean that I'll be skipping through all of the vehicle sections in the game. In the future, there will be other opportunities to show you vehicle combat, and the reason for that is I won't be given access to just a Warthog, but tanks and a flying vehicle called a Hornet. In those vehicles, you don't have to rely on Marines to deal your damage since you can shoot your own weapons while you drive. It makes those levels 100 times more fun than this level in my opinion. This upcoming part is the final part of the level. It might not look like much, but it's one of my favorite encounters of the game. It's particularly tense for a number of reasons. Aside from 2 grunts manning shade turrets, the enemy pool in this section consists entirely of brutes, which have a much higher TTK or time to kill than most other enemies in the game. And brutes normally come with a fixed number of weapons which are much more difficult to deal with than your normal plasma pistols and needlers. Luckily, I have 2 very strong power weapons here, the sniper rifle and the fuel rod gun, which when used smartly, easily thins out the crowd. Whenever I finish this specific section, I'm always left with very little ammo, or no ammo for the sniper, which forces me to get up close and personal. This isn't that much of an issue since cover here is so abundant. The abundance of cover makes it so that I could pop out from one end, ambush one set of enemies, then pop out at the other end, catching others off guard, all while picking up resources on the fly and using their own weapons against them. I love this kind of guerrilla warfare style gameplay. I think it really embodies and plays to Halo's strengths. I'll shut up now so you can watch.
Lord Hood, we made it.
Music to my ears, Commander. What about the Ark?
Fully uncovered, sir.
Then we don't have much time. Marines, the Prophet of Truth doesn't know it yet, but he's about to get kicked right off his throne. You will take our city back and drive our enemy into the grave.
You might not have noticed it since it happened so fast, but in the beginning of this cutscene, there was a bubble shield popping up in one of the camera shots, and my energy drainer also exploded just off screen. This means that the cutscenes are rendered in real time and in the same environment you were fighting in, not a different stage made specifically for cutscenes. You could theoretically set up a bunch of things to explode just before entering a cutscene and watch it all blow up while the cutscenes happen. But anyways, this isn't really important at all. I just love it when games give you the freedom to do stupid things like this, because not all games do.
Good hunting. Keys out.
This level. Oh man, this level. I had so much trouble with this piece of crap level, I don't even really know why. It's not even that long or hard in particular. I just died so many times for some reason. Looking back at it, I have like 2 hours of footage of me doing this level, then dying, then repeating. I'll put some clips up on the screen for you of me dying. If you're anything like me, you might be getting bored of the human environments in this game, and I wouldn't blame you. 5 of the 9 levels in Halo 3 takes place on Earth, which means that more than half of the game takes place on Earth. Don't fear, because after the next mission you'll start seeing more space stuff. But getting back to the issue, the game just has too many Earth levels. This might be fine for other more grounded games, but Halo is a space opera, so more of it should have happened in places other than Earth in my opinion. But this isn't entirely the developer's fault. Well, it is ultimately the developer's fault, but also some of the fault can lie with time constraints. Bungie was planning to do more with the story, but you can only do so much in 3 years, which was the time allotted between Halo 2 and Halo 3's launch dates. A video from HiddenXperia, whose channel I will put in the description, shows that Halo 3 had a massive amount of missions cut from the game. Like, it's actually kind of unreal how ambitious Bungie was planning out the plot of Halo 3. I was gonna warn you of spoilers, but then I realized they aren't actually spoilers because they aren't in the game. Nevertheless, I'll still warn you that listening to the following paragraphs might hurt or alter your experience with the game if you haven't already played it. In HiddenXperia's video, he goes over some old Halo 3 documents which show the original direction Halo 3 was going to take. I won't be covering everything in this video, but I will be mentioning a couple of things which I did find really interesting. There were 2 cut missions that really caught my eye. The first was a level where Chief and Co. were to explore a beautiful ancient Forerunner city. The second was a cut mission where the Chief was supposed to enter a place that resembled the Guardians multiplayer level, where he was to encounter and fight actual Forerunner Guardians. After hearing this, I actually felt a little bit bad. There's no point in crying over spilt milk, since what we have in the final product is what we're stuck with. But it makes me a little bit sad not having access to Bungie's full vision of their Halo 3. Speaking of cut content, did you know that Dark Souls 3 is one of those games that have a massive amount of cut content? There are some videos floating around about what could have been. For example, bonfires were supposed to work in a way that we've never experienced before. Anyways, cut content is really nothing new at all to video games. I guarantee you that basically like 50% of every game in existence has at least some form of cut content. The only difference between games like Halo 3 and most other games is that we know what Halo 3's cut content is or was, and with most other games we don't. It's probably better for our collective mental health if we don't think about what could have been rather than what we have. It just sucks when it happens with a game that we really care about, you know? Drones were first introduced back in the second level, Crow's Nest, but I didn't have enough time to talk about them in between my schizo rants. Now might be a good time to talk about them since I'm fighting them again. Drones. No one likes fighting these assholes. They're trash in every Halo game they're in, but they're especially ass in Halo 2 and Halo Reach. Thankfully, they're not too big of an issue in Halo 3 since they have very little health, and each time you do encounter them, you have friendly AI to take some of the aggro off you. Also, there's only a total of 3 combat encounters with them in this game if I remember correctly. Drones are a good way to shake up combat encounters, but that's all if you ask me. These guys are so numerous and so oppressive that you basically have to become one with the wall you're hiding behind. They essentially turn Halo into Call of Duty for the amount of times you encounter them. Each of them have weapons, meaning that if there are like 20 of these guys, you have to deal with the firepower of 20 guns. And since they're so numerous, you can't really track them one at a time. Their movement arcs are often very erratic, so trying to precisely line up shots is difficult. All of this makes for some really overly difficult and oppressive encounters if you don't deal with them the way the game wants you to. If the Covenant wanted to win the war against humanity, all they had to do was trap Master Chief in a big empty room full of drones and jackal snipers. So the only good way to deal with drones in this game I found is to 1. Hug a wall, 2. Use a weapon with a big magazine and big spread like an assault rifle, and 3. Pray you just don't die if you hang outside of cover for more than a couple seconds. Also, this is another one of those parts in the game where if you want to get close to the action, you have to rely on friendly AI to either drive you or shoot for you, which is a load of crap. Thankfully, there are 2 rocket turrets up in this platform, so I choose to sit here for a little while. These rocket turrets are fun to use since the arcs the missiles take are so different from everything else in the game. They shoot upward and then fall downward almost like a mortar, except they automatically home towards their target on the way down. They're fun to use, but they're designed in a way so that you can't really use it to shoot nearby enemies. They're also very rare in the game. They basically appear in only this level and nowhere else. My theory is that Bungie wanted to encourage players to get close and personal with the enemies, so they kept themselves from putting way more of these turrets in the game. In this section of the level, the game asks the player to destroy a scarab, a huge armored monstrosity which can only be destroyed from a weak point on the inside. In Halo 2, you were also asked to neutralize a scarab, but that sequence is largely scripted and really the only way inside is to jump down into it. I'll put a clip of that here. Halo 3's version of scarabs, I think, is a huge improvement over Halo 2's. There are a number of reasons why I think that is, but one of the biggest reasons is that scarabs become a dynamic part of the sandbox. If you think about the scarab section in Halo 2, the scarab is essentially just a moving platform that moves in straight lines, which also happens to house some strong enemies. The scarab doesn't even do much to threaten you, it's the enemies within that are the threat. Additionally, you can't even personally destroy the scarab in Halo 2, it's only destroyed in a cutscene after you kill the enemies within. The scarab is basically just a set piece in Halo 2. In Halo 3, that changes. Not only are the scarabs moving platforms that house enemies, the scarab itself is a threat. It has 2 huge laser cannon turret things, one at the front end and one at the very top, which can both obliterate you if you aren't careful. Its legs also have the potential to squash and blow up your vehicle if you happen to be in one. So if you aren't careful about your positioning, it can easily kill you. On top of that, boarding the scarab is a big task in itself. In order to board the scarab, you can do several things. Jump onto it from higher ground, either through flying vehicles or from terrain like a hill or a building. Or you can damage one of its forelegs enough so that the scarab is brought down to its knees, giving you an opportunity to jump onto it from the ground. And once you board the scarab, it's not done yet. You also have to deal with the enemies within, either avoiding them or killing them. After that, you have to find the scarab's core and damage it enough to put it into a destruction state, where you have to run away from it and clear it before it explodes. And it's a huge explosion which can kill you if you're standing too close. In this case, I take a big chunk of damage worth more than half my shield since the explosion knocked back an allied vehicle and hit me. It's a really cool and interesting section. Over the course of Halo 3, the player is tasked with killing a total of 4 scarabs, which you'll see later. They are some of my favorite parts in the game, so I'm excited to get to show you that. If you've been paying attention to the middle of the screen, you would have seen that the crosshair changes shape and design every time I switch weapons. I think this is a really cool thing that Halo does that most other games don't do. In other shooters like Call of Duty, the crosshair stays mostly the same. Some generic lines that indicate the spread or accuracy your bullets will have, based on the current movement speed or action the player is taking at the given moment. There are some outliers in the COD games, but even those outliers will only go to the extent of assigning a general crosshair to a specific weapon type, like bows or assault rifles and whatnot. In Halo, every single weapon in the game is assigned a specific crosshair. This really doesn't affect gameplay all that much, given that accuracy isn't such a big deal in Halo, at least in the campaign modes, since bullet magnetism and aim assist are so aggressive. But it does help to give each weapon some personality. Different crosshairs will change shapes and sizes, and helps the player compartmentalize what role any given weapon has in the sandbox. For instance, precision power weapons like the sniper rifle and beam rifle have a smaller and tighter crosshairs than any of the other weapons in the game, while your more common weapons like the assault rifle, SMG, and plasma rifles each have relatively big and wide crosshairs. Even if you don't pay close attention to it, your brain will subconsciously take note and think, I should get up close and personal with this weapon to get the most out of it. The crosshairs of this weapon are pretty small. I think I should take my time aiming with this weapon from a distance. It's just a small, unnecessary detail of the game that doesn't ultimately matter but still adds to the experience, even if only just a little. Speaking of crosshairs, I have some more interesting information about them. If you booted up the original Halo 3 on the Xbox 360 and all the other Halos on the 360 for that matter, you might notice something different about the crosshair. That is the position they're placed. In the 360 versions, the crosshair is placed slightly lower than what you're seeing right now on screen. In fact, I can actually show you what it looks like right now, since it's actually in the options. Most modern games have the centered crosshairs that you've been seeing throughout this whole playthrough, but Bungie games in particular had this weird lowered crosshair. By default, MCC turns off this lowered crosshairs and gives you the more standardized centered crosshair. I didn't even think about how natural centered reticles felt. I assumed that all Halo games had centered reticles. I only realized that lowered crosshairs were a thing after I saw it in the options menu, and I remembered that this was how some of the older games were played. When I first noticed this, it kind of blew my mind. I first theorized that these lowered crosshairs were made because of the way old CRT TVs displayed video games. Of course, I found out that had nothing to do with CRT TVs after I did a little bit more research. At a GDC talk, a Bungie employee explained that since Halo 2, their games have had this lowered crosshair to help make the world appear more expansive and taller. I've tried to go back and do repeat playthroughs with the lowered crosshair, but I couldn't deal with it for whatever reason, so I've stuck with the centered crosshairs since. But the fact that you're able to tick an option in the settings to change it back to the way it used to be, I really appreciate. In this part of the level, the player is supposed to destroy a Covenant AA gun to clear some space for the frigates in the air. Hypothetically, you could actually just speedrun strat this whole part and go straight to the AA gun to blow it up without dealing with any of the enemies. Now that I mention it, you could actually do this for many points in the game. You can probably get away with doing this easily on difficulties like easy and normal, but the enemies will give you a much harder time on heroic and legendary. They'll kill you before you even get the chance to make it past. I said it before, but I really don't like leaving enemies alive in these types of games. I did it earlier in the game, particularly in that one vehicle section, and it just didn't feel right. It leaves me with an unsatisfied void in my gamer soul that can only be filled with death. I'll finish this thought later, but since the cutscene's coming up, I want to talk about that first. Before, I said that the storytelling in Halo 3 isn't as strong as in Halo 2's, but this doesn't mean that the cutscenes are worse. In fact, I think in some areas the cutscenes are better. This next one is an example of that. I don't know how much of it can be attributed to the increase in graphical fidelity and computational limitations or even filmmaking techniques, but I think Bungie nailed the sense of scale in this game's cutscenes. Like, really nailed it. I mean, you look at this and tell me.
All ships, fire at will.
This is the way the world ends.
What did Truth just do? Did he activate the rings?
No, sir. But he certainly did something.
Evac wounded and regroup. Wherever Truth went.
Sir, new contact slipping in.
What is it? More brutes?
Worse.
Of course, you can also thank Marty O'Donnell, the composer, for the music that really adds to the sense of awe some of these cutscenes inspire. But I'll talk more about Marty's fantastic score later. If this is your first experience with Halo, this level might have taken you by surprise. You might have noticed it subconsciously from the ominous skybox or the strange haze permeating the atmosphere, but something about the level seems more oppressive than usual. That's because this level reintroduces the Flood, a faction separate to the Covenant, the enemy we've been fighting for the past 4 levels. In Halo 1, the Flood's introduction was fantastic. When you first start the level, it's about a 4 to 5 minute long trek through a quiet, ominous, and mostly empty Forerunner facility. This alone could give you some uncanny vibes, but if that weren't enough, a 5-minute cutscene plays, showing a UNSC squad falling apart as they encounter some infection forms. On top of that, the player themselves are forced to fight waves of these infection forms and then fighting their first couple combat forms just a few moments later. It's a nice, well-directed, slow burn build-up towards the enemy type. That being said, Halo 3's reintroduction kind of pales in comparison. However, given that the enemies were already introduced in the first 2 games, I have to give it more of a pass. My worry about it is that players who've chosen Halo 3 as their first Halo game might have had a less curated experience, and perceived them as less of a terrifying threat compared to those who first experienced the Flood in Halo 3.
Halo 1, not Halo 3, dumbass.
Anyways, the Flood is a very interesting enemy type to fight. One of the reasons this is because their AI acts very differently from the Covenant's AI. Most Flood enemies are scripted to basically pathfind their way towards you at all times. Sometimes they'll walk, sometimes they'll run, but they're making their way towards you all the time, basically. This is interesting because in contrast, the Covenant is a much more versatile foe. Sometimes they'll run straight at you like the Flood does, but they can also run away or pin themselves behind cover so as not to give you an easy shot. If you asked me which faction is more fun to fight, the Flood or the Covenant, I couldn't give you a clear and concise answer. I would probably lean more towards the Covenant, since Bungie themselves were confident enough to make later games focus solely on the Covenant. But each of the two are fun to fight for different reasons, and the important thing is that both of the enemy types are fun to fight. Having two factions that are fun to fight in the same game is just good for variety's sake.
Rise up and I will kill you. Again and again.
In Halo 3 at least, most Flood enemy types are real squishy compared to the Covenant. This is probably because you'll be mowing down hordes and hordes of these guys in any given encounter. If they're too tanky, they run the risk of being too difficult to deal with, so I think the amount of health they're given in this game was the right choice. That being said, this doesn't mean that they're simple to deal with. Their sheer numbers can overwhelm you easily if you're not careful. And they're not just mindless zombies that want to eat your brains either. These guys can wield guns too. I'm no lore expert, so I can't really explain the lore as well as other people, but what I do know is that the Flood is the singular most ancient and greatest threat, not only to mankind, but the entirety of life in the universe as well. If you've been paying attention, you've probably seen that I've been fighting both alien and human Flood types. That's because the Flood is unprejudiced and it will infect anything it can get its hands on to use as a weapon. The Flood is a terrifying threat, because not only can they consume other life forms and zombify them, but they also have the potential to reach different stages of intelligence. I mean, they're smart right now, but if an infection gets out of hand, the Flood can sort of band together to make something called a Gravemind, a huge, monstrous, tentacly abomination with a terrifying amount of smarts. Not only that, but there are even more stages in its evolution even after becoming a Gravemind. The Flood can consume even more given the opportunity and become unimaginably big planet-sized monsters. Unfortunately, you don't really get exposed to this kind of stuff in the games, more so in the books, but it's still really cool info to know. When making their Halo games, Bungie had an ethos in mind called the Rule of Cool. What the Rule of Cool is that things that are cool ultimately would take precedence over actual logic, and sometimes even contradict the story or the lore of the franchise. To give you a really plain example, vehicles like the Warthog in this game have unlimited ammo. In a hypothetical instance, if the rounds that eject out of the Warthog turret were to never despawn, you could technically fire until the entire map was filled with bullet casings. In no shape or form would that ever be possible logically in real life, but it's cool to shoot super powerful bullets indefinitely from a turret in a video game, so that's why they made it like that. But the Rule of Cool isn't just limited to logistics and video game mechanics. It also extends to writing in the story. If you really scrutinize the story in the Halo games, you can probably find some logical inconsistencies that are explained away because of any number of reasons. Take Sergeant Johnson, for example. In Halo 1, Master Chief destroyed a Halo ring, and Sergeant Johnson was on that ring. There was no possible explanation you could come up with to theorize how he could have survived. At the end, he even hugs an elite, accepting his death. But in Halo 2, Sergeant Johnson comes back, and this time a more prominent character. Why? Because both fans and Bungie themselves thought Johnson's character was cool, and they wanted to bring him back. In other words, Johnson's cool factor overrode the writing. Hence the Rule of Cool. Aside from 1, all the way back in middle school, I haven't read the books, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were plenty of things from the books that just didn't make it into the game or were barely touched upon, resulting from the use of the Rule of Cool. It's not just Halo that makes use of this rule. There are plenty of other games, books, movies, and other media that make use of it. And on paper, this can sound absolutely disastrous, especially from a writing standpoint. A valid question against the Rule of Cool would be, well, if you don't respect your own writing, how can the audience? I don't have a clear answer for this, but I think the answer might come down to how much disbelief both the audience and the writers are willing to suspend. If you look closely at Bungie's Halos, it's clear they didn't take themselves too seriously. Some documents show that they cared about making the games fun shooters first and foremost, and it's reflected very well in the games, I think. Of course, the audience doesn't just fall under binary categories either. It's never as simple as a you either love it or hate it kind of thing. Some fans seriously don't give two shits about the story and just want to shoot aliens. But there are also some fans that really enjoy dissecting the lore and the story, making connections between wafer-thin pieces of information. Neither of these types of fans are better than the other, they're just fans. And I think I lie in the sweet spot somewhere in between the two, thinking that the gameplay is the most important thing, but knowing some of the story and lore can also enhance the experience itself. But there are also some games that don't present their stories in such an overt fashion like most games tend to do. Dark Souls 1, one of my favorite games of all time, takes this to the extreme. Past the opening cutscene, basically nothing is explained in cutscenes beyond how cool or strange some bosses and some areas are. Of course, there are always things like item descriptions which help to give some lore tidbits, but even then, the story and the lore in that game is cryptic as fuck. I think this hands-off approach to storytelling works well for video games. Hands-off might be the wrong word to use. I think hands-on might be a more apt description, since in order to even piece together some kind of story in Dark Souls 1, the player really has to apply themselves. So yeah, I think the hands-on approach works well for video games. In fact, I'll actually do myself one better. The hands-on approach works especially well because it's in a video game, since the whole point of video games is to interact with the world and, play it and interact with it, not sit back and watch a movie. But do I think that this kind of storytelling belongs in all games? Definitely not. I think it depends on what kind of experience you're going for in the first place. Hypothetically speaking, if Halo 2, the most story-dense game in the franchise, had all of its cutscenes wiped from it, leaving only the gameplay, the game would lose a lot, in my opinion. So much of the game's personality revolves around its clever dialogue between characters, interesting action scenes, and the beautiful music that accompanies all of it. If you remove the cutscenes, you remove a big part of Halo 2's experience. Even if I do feel like more games should be developed with the Souls storytelling approach in mind, it just goes to show that certain methodologies and ethoses in developing games aren't a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Some games will benefit more from a heavy-handed kind of storytelling approach, but for some games it might detract from the experience. But Halo 3's entire story isn't told through gameplay and cutscenes. There are also other things called terminals, which I'll get to in just the next level. Anyways, I do have some time here, so I'd like to finish my thoughts on unlimited amounts of respawning enemies, which I started talking about during the last cutscene. I don't feel great when some games have unlimited respawning enemies. It makes me feel much more accomplished to go from area to area, clearing the enemies out of it. I don't know to what extent, but I believe even the Halo games have unlimited respawning enemies, especially the flood levels, but I might be wrong about that. Feel free to correct me if I am. Unlimited amounts of respawning enemies can definitely add some frantic, hectic tension to your game, and I think it's definitely used to the intended effect in those specific levels I was talking about, but again, I just don't like leaving enemies alive. I'm sad to say this, but the first 4 missions were kind of nothing burgers. The cutscenes in each of them did almost nothing to advance the plot, and instead they served as mere introductions for the major characters from each faction. This is also part of why I think Halo 3's story is worse than 2's. Because in Halo 2 the plot gets rolling really as soon as a couple levels in, whereas in Halo 3 you're just kind of hanging around Earth, defending it for more than half the game. I'm glad to say that after this cutscene, things start to speed up. We've been introduced to all of the factions, the UNSC, the Arbiter and his allies, and the Covenant, and the Flood. From now on, we'll begin to visit Forerunner areas, and more importantly, the plot ball starts rolling along. For now though, I want to shut up now, so you and I can both enjoy the next cutscene. These are probably some of my favorites in the entire game.
Oracle? Can it be saved?
Uncertain. This storage device has suffered considerable trauma. Its matrices are highly unstable.
Perhaps one of our technicians.
That will not be necessary.
Chief.
Success!
Hi, Charity. The Prophet's holy city is on its way to Earth, with an army of Flood. I can't tell you everything. It's not safe. The Gravemind, it knows I'm in the system.
It's just a message.
Let it play.
But it doesn't know about the portal, where it leads. On the other side, there's a solution, a way to stop the Flood, without firing the remaining Halo rings. Hurry, Chief. The Ark. There isn't much time.
I'm sorry.
No matter, Oracle. We've heard enough. Our fight is through the portal. With the brutes and the bastard truth.
Fine. We'll remain here. Hold out as long as we can.
Did you not hear? Your world is doomed. A Flood army, a Gravemind, has you in its sights. You barely survived a small contamination.
And you, shipmaster, just glassed half a continent. Maybe the Flood isn't all I should be worried about.
One single Flood spore can destroy a species. Were it not for the Arbiter's Council, I would have glassed your entire planet.
Sir, with respect, Cortana has a solution.
Cortana? Did you see her condition? How damaged she is? She could be corrupted for all we know. Her solution could be a Flood trap.
We should go through the portal. Find out for sure.
What we should do, Commander, is understand, clearly, that this is humanity's final stand. Here, at Earth. We go, we risk everything. Every last man, woman, and child. If we stand our ground, we might just have a chance.
No. If your construct is wrong, then the Flood is already won.
I'll find Cortana's solution. And I'll bring it back.
Earth is all we have left. You trust Cortana that much?
Sir. Yes, sir.
This is either the best decision you've ever made or the worst. Hell of it is, Chief. I doubt I'll live long enough to find out which.
Brute ships, staggered line. Shipmaster, they outnumber us 3 to 1. Then it is an even fight. All cruisers fire at will. Burn their mongrel hides.
True ship isn't taking part in the attack. He must have gone to ground.
Roger that, ma'am. We're on him. Kick the door.
Sergeant Major. She'll hold.
All right, pop the hatch.
That's something.
Enjoy it while you can, Marines. As soon as we land, we're right back to it. Priority 1. Secure a landing zone for the commander's frigate. Keep your eyes and ears open. We need all the intel we can get. Wherever the hell we are. Stand to, Marines. Hoorah! Go, go, go!
Sorry for not speaking for a long time. I know you missed my extremely erotic voice. But those two cutscenes are just so fucking sick. They're always just pleasures to watch. Sometimes when I'm walking around the house naked, I look out the window, slowly pull open the blinds, and reenact that hero shot with Master Chief. But seriously, man, that last part was just so sick. I've been in love with it ever since I first saw it as a kid, back in 2007. In some ways, the beginning of this level is a bit reminiscent of one of the levels in Halo 1, called the Truth and Reconciliation. Truth and Reconciliation also takes place in an arid kind of climate. Additionally, you also start out with a sniper rifle, and enemies are unaware of your presence until you make yourself known, just like this one. But that's about where the similarities end. Also, you probably saw me use the BR there, but I only used it to kill a couple of grunts or a single grunt, so I really didn't get any use out of it at all. I haven't talked about it before, but the sniper rifle is really fun to use in this game. It's extremely powerful if you're good at aiming with it. A single headshot with the sniper is enough to insta-kill most enemies, and a double headshot is enough to insta-kill higher ranked ones, like enemies with gold armor. And it might look like it since the bullets travel so fast, but the sniper rifle doesn't fire hit-scan bullets. Each of the rounds count as projectiles. You can even load up a forge map or something and attempt to snipe something like a fusion coil from a long distance. You'll notice that it doesn't explode the moment you pull the trigger. When fired at specific angles on certain solid surfaces, the bullets fired by the sniper can also ricochet. Theoretically, you can kill an enemy that's fully obscured by cover if you angled a shot just right. The campaign doesn't provide much opportunity for this, and nor does it properly teach you about these specific properties, but the fact that you're even able to do this does allow for a greater level of skill expression. Since I don't ever do it in this playthrough, I'll put a clip up here to show you. I think I read online somewhere that some Halo pros prefer the way the Halo 3 sniper feels compared to all the other games. I couldn't exactly tell you why. I know for a fact the ricocheting bullets aren't new to the series, but maybe it's the way the sniper looks or sounds to shoot appeals to these pros. I don't know, I couldn't tell you. But all I know is that the sniper in Halo 3 is my favorite sniper in the series, and that's validated by the fact that a few of the pros share that same sentiment. That means my favorite game is automatically better than your favorite game. Also, I never really got the chance to talk about it since the last time I fought them, but these enemies are called the Hunters. These guys wield a big shield on their left and a laser cannon on the right, and they're heavily armored. They're interesting to fight against since they're really tanky enemies compared to all of the other ones in the Covenant. You can deal with them a couple of different ways. One, you can shoot their weaker unarmored spots. There's a small one in their head area, so if you're accurate enough, you can concentrate the fire there. Or you can go toward the bigger target on the back. This back area does have armor too, but you can easily damage it enough to break it off with some grenades or something. Two, you can just brute force them with explosives. As you saw there, I did a combination of the two, picking the first one off with my brute shot and grenades, dealing some damage to the last one, and then finishing him off via his weak points. The easiness of the fight depends on the amount of resources that you have. If you manage to get past the couple of fights with enough explosives, you could just go ham sticking them with grenades, but if you're out of grenades and other explosives, you just gotta do it the old-fashioned way. Coming up here is the very first terminal we'll encounter. Once I get to it, I'll be giving a long-ass summary and also my thoughts on it. So this is your last chance to get to experience it yourself if you want to go do that now. I'll put up the time on screen to skip to if you don't want to hear this. This is the first of the terminals I was talking about earlier. Admittedly, I haven't taken the time out to really dissect a lot of the story the terminals provide. Again, I'm not really a lore guy, so I can't really give you specifics, but I can give you a quick rundown of the story contained within the terminals. At first glance, it just looks like some logistical mumbo-jumbo made by the Forerunners when they were fighting the Flood. It shows how dire their situation really was, with their population being absolutely decimated, and the time they had left on the clock was really getting down to the triple and even double digits. But if you stay on the terminal for a while, something else seems to hijack your terminal and take you to another sector of information altogether. In these new lines, you'll see a conversation between two characters, who are called L and D, which we later find out are abbreviations for the Librarian and the Didact, two characters who make an appearance in Halo 4. In later terminals, conversations between the two play out and basically they're having disagreements, something about saving the lives of thousands of different species in the goal of keeping the universe biodiverse. The Librarian plays the idealistic role, with her being adamant about saving each one of those species because their lives are finite and precious, whereas the Didact plays a more ignorant role, more of which I'll touch on later. The Librarian basically prepares the indexing and preservation of different species, including humans, with the intention to fire the Halo Rings to basically nuke all sentient life in the galaxy, depriving the Flood of its food. This shows some crazy foresight on how the war on the Flood could have easily been ended, but the Didact kinda had tunnel vision. He seemed hell-bent on saving his wife, the Librarian, so he formulated a much more risky plan. He created a mega AI called the Mendicant Bias to combat the Flood and make difficult decisions more decisively and more swiftly than the Forerunners could have. This way, he could brute force a victory against the Flood instead of committing species-wide suicide by activating the Halo Rings, and more importantly to him, saving his wife. And of course, things go wrong here. Mendicant Bias became corrupted by the Flood and turned against his creators, the Forerunners. The Didact realizes the error of his ways and builds a new AI called Offensive Bias to combat both Mendicant Bias and the Flood in the hopes of finally firing the Halo Array, their last resort. He goes on to sort of repent to the Librarian, quite beautifully I have to say. After the Librarian confirms that she will die on Earth, and tells him he should be proud he fought valiantly and will eventually win after making the decision to fire the Halo Rings, the Didact says, "Proud? When I have failed you utterly, how can I feel anything but sorrow?" He goes on to say, "I picture you in your garden, surveying all you have created, surveying all you have preserved. And I curse the circumstance that keeps my finger on the trigger. Of all the fates to befall us, this is the cruelest of all. My inaction and hesitation and foolishness kept me here, on the wrong side of the line, and 300 years of our society's failure and miscalculation makes me your executioner. It's too much to bear." And to finish his monologue about defeating the Flood and Mendicant Bias, he says, "I will burn this stinking menace in your name, and then I will begin the great journey without you, carrying this bitter record. Those who come after will know what we bought with this, what you bought, and the price you paid." It's a beautiful piece of writing here. The outcome of the war on the Flood and the mishaps the Didact had were nothing short of tragic. And that little monologue he had at the end there really helped to humanize and give the librarian and the Didact personality, characters that were otherwise non-existent in Halo 3. But that's not all. That's just the shit you get if you're playing on Heroic and below. If you're playing on Legendary, you get a whole bunch of more story in the terminals, this time about the Flood and Mendicant Bias. Now, I know even less about this one since I've only completed Halo 3 on Legendary a couple times and many years ago, but I did read up on it a little bit. Here's a quick summary of Mendicant Bias's story. So, Mendicant Bias was created by the Foreigners, as you know. It's an extremely intelligent and capable AI for the purpose of defeating the Flood. At first, Mendicant Bias starts out on the Forerunner side, but eventually he actually converses with the Gravemind. This alone adds some unnerving depth to the Flood. The fact that it can actually converse with and have a conversation with one of the most intelligent things in the universe is crazy, but that's not where it ends. The Gravemind discusses with Mendicant Bias philosophical topics about existence. I mean, this Plato shit is crazy. Imagine a literal parasite speaking to you about the meaning of life. And when the Gravemind speaks, it is convincing. It speaks politely, rationally, and even charms Mendicant Bias by speaking about its origins as a greater intelligence than the Forerunners. It goes on to speak with Mendicant Bias and argues against their quote-unquote pointless conflict, and it seeks a resolution without violence. That resolution being the unison and the oneness of the Flood, as its nature is obviously to convert all sentient life to the Flood. The Gravemind says that it can give immortality, strength, and companionship to each being in the galaxy, that by unifying with the Flood, they can be delivered from death, weakness, and loneliness. They go on to have philosophical debates for more than 40 fucking years, bro. 40 years. Hang on, there's a part coming up here that I want to talk about briefly. I'll get back to this terminal stuff later.
Roger that. Beginning my descent.
Look! Up high! Here she comes! Is the Dawn rated for atmosphere? I guess we're gonna find out. Hey, take cover!
Thanks, Chief.
This part really is awe-inspiring. The Forward Unto Dawn descends from the atmosphere bearing gifts. I know I said it before, but Halo 3 really kicked things up a notch in the wow factor department. But this part is only effective if the player is paying attention. Such is the consequence of making this part gameplay, and not, say, in a cutscene. I specifically remember as a kid wondering what to do next since I didn't really give a shit about the story, and I completely missed this part as a result. This part is really effective because a number of reasons. The first part is the visual aspect, the most noticeable of the bunch. The frigate seems to almost appear out of thin air. It casts its shadow over the dunes, it drops in quickly and reveals its huge size as it makes its landing. There's screen shake, and the sand is getting kicked up and swept away, really selling it as this huge monolithic-ass thing. I'm no music critic, but Marty O'Donnell's score for the sequence really puts some oomph into this whole part here. Without the music, I don't think the Forward Unto Dawn's landing would have been as impressive. And the third part is in-game implications. As the ship makes its landing, it also creates a huge gust of wind, pushing back even things as big as wraiths. You unironically have to be a little bit careful here, otherwise the debris getting knocked back might damage you or just kill you outright. Even if this sequence is merely scripted, this is the part that really solidifies and sells the Forward Unto Dawn as a real, tangible object in this world that you're in. This whole sequence really strikes a chord with me, because not only is it an excellently directed little moment here, it also helps to give the player a sense that they're just a smaller part of a bigger whole. It's a reminder that there are people up there fighting on your side too. As legendary as Master Chief is, he isn't the only part of humanity contributing to the war. Of course, his actions ultimately lead to the end of the conflict, but he's just one guy. Without the efforts of Hood, Miranda, Johnson, Cortana, or literally every other Marine and even some aliens like the Arbiter, the outcome wouldn't have turned out the same. Anyways, thanks to the support from the Dawn, we now have access to the Scorpion, Halo's version of tanks. This thing is a beast. It can one-shot small vehicles, two-shot big ones, take out the Phantoms, insta-kill hunters and literally every infantry enemy for that matter. It took more than half the game, but we finally got one. If we compare Halo 3 to Halo 2, it really wasn't all that long to get a hold of one of these bad boys. Only the second or third mission, I believe. I don't know whether or not this late introduction was due to cut content. Maybe in some of the cut content, the player would have been able to man a tank much earlier in the game. Or maybe this decision was just by design, saving one of the most powerful vehicles for the late game. Either way, I like the decision they made as it does help to hasten the pace of the game. It also can add to a sense of progression, forcing the player to have gotten familiar with the more standard vehicles first before introducing them to the Scorpion. This Scorpion just absolutely shreds the battlefield, and if you take enemies out from far away before they can shoot you, you'll basically be in no danger at all for much of the time. It's almost unfair how good this thing is. It even moves fast enough to dodge some slower moving, heavy-hitting projectiles if you have good reflexes. I'm gonna speed up this part just because it's really boring. All I'm doing is just walking and waiting for things to move along. And while I'm at it, I can talk about the terminal stuff with Mendicant Bias and the Flood. They go on to have philosophical debates for more than 40 fucking years, bro. 40 years. Some of us poor bastards don't even live that long. If that doesn't go to show how unfathomably intelligent and godlike these two monolithic beings are, I don't know what is. It really gives the sense that these two are beyond our measly comprehension. Anyways, Mendicant Bias ends up becoming convinced by the Gravemind. He becomes corrupted effectively and switches sides. This forces the Forerunners to play their trump card, which are, as you know, the activation of the Halo Array. Mendicant Bias and the Flood eventually lose the war as a result of the Halo Rings, and that's where the story ends. Or is it? Nope, there's still one more part of the story told through the terminals. Mendicant Bias is still very much alive, and he seeks to atone for his sins. In the final terminal, he basically says that he wants to show his creators that he made a mistake and that he's changed for the better, and that he'll help Master Chief survive everything that happens in Halo 3. And that's basically the gist of the story told through the terminals. Again, I'm no Halo lore scholar, and I'm not nearly as smart as I pretend to be, so I probably could have presented that story to you much better than I did just now. So if you're wanting a more detailed explanation of the story, you could, play Halo 3 or at least look up some videos or read up on the wiki. This story is basically just extra flavor if you really think about it. At no point does the game ever present this story to you as a sort of necessary addition. You don't need to have read and understood the terminal story to enjoy the main story in Halo 3 after all. It's not necessary, but this supplemental knowledge can really enhance your experience with the game. Having another layer of knowledge as you fight through levels can give you another perspective on the timeline of the Halo games. And I think it's really great that the devs even included this stuff for the people who are hungry for more story than just the main game. I love it when devs do this kind of stuff. A similar thing can be said of the books. They aren't required to enjoy the story in the Halo games. I personally have only read one a long time ago, and my memory's pretty fuzzy on it, so I can effectively say I've never read any of the books. The games are what came first, and they're what should be focused on the most, so everything other than the games can't truly be considered canon, or should just be taken with a grain of salt since they can easily be overwritten in the games with that rule of cool thing I was talking about earlier. But Halo isn't just limited to books. Halo is a transmedia franchise. You can go online and listen to some audio stories like what Halo 5 featured, or comics, or even anime, and God forbid, the Halo TV show. Oh god. This kind of extracurricular storytelling, for lack of better words, can cause some issues though. Even though the games are still the top priority for the storytelling in Halo, there is some overlap which came from later games in the franchise. Take Blue Team for example, Chief's OG Spartan fire team he grew up with, but only in the books. In absolutely none of the Halo games were they ever mentioned even once, and yet in Halo 5 they make an appearance and are even playable characters. Even if we ignore the pile of steaming shit that was Halo 5's campaign, this Blue Team thing was kind of a jarring experience to me when I first saw them in the game, and I wondered if any players new to the franchise even knew that these guys existed. I really think introducing them in Halo 5 in that way was a bad decision, especially for more casual enjoyers of the franchise like me. Characters from the books or the other things should really stay separate, unless you establish a believable narrative reason to put them in the game, other than to have 4-player co-op avatars. As it stands, the way Blue Team was implemented was just a very forced and ham-fisted way to include fan-favorite characters from the books. You could say that about the story in Halo 5 as a whole, but really that's just a whole other can of worms. This doesn't mean that Halo 3 is entirely off the hook for this kind of stuff either. In one of the later levels, Cortana speaks some of the same dialogue that Dr. Halsey does in the books, but there's a good enough narrative reason for doing so. Cortana has been basically speaking nonsense for the entire game up until that specific point, so players who don't even know it's Halsey's lines won't even make a connection. And you can also excuse it for being this way since Cortana is essentially a clone of Dr. Halsey. But for Blue Team in Halo 5, it's written so poorly and out of the blue that it's just jarring to have them in the game. Anyways, I think the games over all others should be king. I don't want to sound like some sort of purist, but when a story is stretched out over all kinds of different forms of media, it makes it kinda hard to keep track of which one is the main one. I think Bungie's approach was the best one, where the books were mostly separate from the games. This scripted sequence here is short, but effective.
Hey, what gives?
It seems I've crossed a circuit.
Well, let me have a look.
Oracle!
Little bastard stung me!
I did not want you to come to any harm.
Got a funny way of showing it.
Guilty Spark here uses his laser to push a Marine out of the way. If you know the ending of the game, it's foreshadowing of something more sinister about Spark, but I'll talk about it later. My sincerest apologies, but from now on I'll be speaking with this horrible noise-canceling sound. It's really, really hot where I live, and I live in like the middle of the Pacific Ocean on an island in the middle of nowhere, and it's super humid, so I just had to turn on my AC. So yeah, my deepest apologies for that if the quality of my voice has gone down low. Anyways, that section back there asks the player to deal with the second of the 4 scarabs in the game. Since I already spoke about how great scarab encounters are in the game, I don't really have much to add. I killed the scarab there just by shooting its legs with the tank to bring it down to the ground, and then I boarded it on foot afterwards. However, I realized that this might be boring for you to watch since it's very similar to how I killed it the first time. I went back a second time to board it while I was still walking using a grav lift. I'll put up a clip now just for variety's sake.
Take out its legs. Climb aboard. Find that power core, Chief.
Shelter from Halo's fire, in the hopes that more of our common...
Backplating looks vulnerable. Light it up!
Of course, if you're an actual madman, you can use a warthog or a chopper up on that platform and use it as sort of a ramp to land on the scarab. This would be extremely badass, but way too risky, especially since I have the Iron Skull on. This area is the Ark. It's a beautiful Forerunner facility built to activate the Halo rings remotely, or even repair them if they're damaged. It also acts as a safe haven from the Halos, as anyone inside wouldn't be affected by the Halo pulse.
A complete understanding of Installation 04. My makers wisely limited my knowledge of all other strategic facilities. Compartmentalization, in case I was ever captured by the Flood.
Can you tell me where we are exactly?
Here.
And truth?
Near one of the Ark's supraluminal communication arrays, I'm afraid. Unfortunate. The meddler has triggered a barrier, a defensive perimeter around the Ark's core. The barrier will be difficult to disable. How odd that my makers would place such a comprehensive defense around a single... Oh my.
What is it?
Phantom!
Spark, move.
We must get past that barrier, or the meddler will destroy it all.
Chief, you got a whole mess of hostile air inbound. Get back inside while we take them out.
Follow the Oracle, Spark. I will help you, Sergeant, clear the sky.
Sir, Pelican's gonna land 1 level down.
The installation was my responsibility.
There's a brute chieftain with a gravity hammer up ahead and taunting you. If you're quick enough, you can actually kill this guy before he gets to the next area, but that's risky since you have to deal with both him and the invisible brutes at the same time. And even if you do get to him, you have to deal with him extra quickly, otherwise he'll activate his invincibility. I don't do it in this playthrough, but I did go back and do it, which I'll show you real quick right here.
The pack will feast on you! Feel yourselves.
Most people won't even know you can kill him up here, or that he even exists up here in the first place since they're busy dealing with camouflaged brutes. But I really like it when games allow you to go the extra mile and get some enemies out of the way beforehand. That being said, I don't recommend you kill that brute chieftain if it's your first playthrough, because just up in the next area there's a really cool and unique segment. In this part, you're challenged to a one-on-one duel by the chieftain, while the lower ranked ones sit back and cheer him on. Additionally, if you really tune out the noise the brutes make, you can hear the Prophet of Truth say something along the lines of, "If you lose against Chief, you'll be left behind, abandonment of the great journey, yap 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 yap." If you don't use any weapons at all and just melee him, the chieftain won't even pull out his gravity hammer. He'll just have honorable fisticuffs with you. That being said, only meleeing him would be boring for me to play and boring for you to watch, since he has so much health, and since it's so easy to exploit his AI to never hit you. So if you start using guns, the fight will still be a one-on-one. None of the other brutes will see this as dishonorable, and the playing field will be a bit more level since he can use his gravity hammer. Sadly, he never gets to use it here since I kill him too quickly, but I do have a much better fight with one of these guys in the next level, so I'm excited to get to show you how cool it is to fight against one of these guys. Fun fact, I have a really clear memory of a kid going through this room and taking out the weaker enemies first, and aggroing the rest as a result. It was only after I did another playthrough, a little older and more appreciative of my surroundings, that I discovered that you could have a 1v1 with a chieftain. Anyways, this part is really cool because it helps to give the brutes personality, something they're lacking in Halo 3. Tartarus was killed off in Halo 2, so the brutes don't really have a face or a persona that you could really associate with the brutes. It's not as good as in Halo 2, in fact, it's much worse, but at least this part was in Halo 3, which helps to quell some of that problem. Some. Barring this one right now, from now on I won't be talking over the cutscenes, because each and every cutscene after this is just way too good for me to speak over. They're just too well directed, and most character interactions are just way too juicy for me not to show you. I just want you to pay attention to how much the music can really add some urgency and emotion to what's being shown on screen. Okay, I'll shut up now.
Barbara's right. We have priorities too. Until we kill Truth, stop the rings from firing, nothing else matters. Hit these 3 generators, and the barrier will fall? A small section, yes. Good enough. Johnson, drop the chief at the first generator, then head to the third. The elites will punch right down the middle.
Roger that.
Charlie, Foxtrot. Tower 1 approaches, active AAA.
Mayday! I can't control her!
Pelican down! Pelican down!
Brace yourselves, we're going in a little hot!
Commander, this is Kilo 2-3. Lost my wingman and our only hog. Over.
I just couldn't bring myself to speak over that whole sequence, especially as the music was playing. Of course, the cinematic itself was fantastic, the cinematography and choreography and all that shit was very good. But I think the music is what really ties the scene together with the tension of gameplay. It's so good, man. Marty O'Donnell is just so talented. I firmly believe that his score for the Halo games, Halo 2, 3, and ODST especially, are some of the most beautiful pieces of art ever orchestrated by mankind. I mean, listen to this. This is menu music. Menu music, dude. Bro, that shit could bring a tear to my eye. And this is just one track out of dozens in this game that are just amazing. There are countless tracks from each of the games that are just so beautiful to even describe. I only took a couple music classes when I was very young and a single piano class in college, but sometimes I wish I was more versed in music for the sole purpose of more deeply analyzing Halo's soundtrack. So much emotion is conveyed in these songs, and I actually get very passionate when I think about Halo's soundtrack, as cringeworthy as that seems. It's just so unique and so beautiful, and it's in wonderful contrast to the games themselves, which are at its core military-themed shooters. Where else would you get these beautiful and even religious-sounding motifs in a fucking military-themed first-person shooter? The answer is nowhere else. It's so crazy to me because at its core, Halo is a series about shooting aliens in the face, right? And yet each part of the experience, be it gameplay, cutscenes, or even just menu music, are all accompanied by this beautiful, ethereal soundscape. As pretentious as it sounds, the contrast of the violence depicted in the games and the heavenly score really adds a layer of depth to the whole experience. It almost makes you feel like you're not fighting just to shoot aliens in the face, you're fighting for something greater, like your heroism is in some service of some grand plan. No other series I've come across has even come close to capturing the same sense of a mix of valor and sorrow that Halo's score inspires. It's crazy, dude. The music adds so much to the game that it really wouldn't be the same experience at all. If you remove Marty, you remove a big part of Halo. In fact, that's what happened after Reach. Without Marty, each of the successive sequels in the series failed to capture that same vibe the previous games have, but I'll speak about 343's garbage later. If you remember the song that played during the last cutscene, you probably noticed that the piano had a very heavy presence. In fact, for a lot of the game, the piano has a really heavy emphasis put onto it. I couldn't speak for Marty, but I do have a theory for why the piano was such a big focus for Halo 3's soundtrack. Of course, he might have given an explanation somewhere in the dozens of interviews he's done recently, but I don't really care since this is all speculation, and speculation is often more fun than knowing the truth. Anyways, when I took that piano class in college, I remember my professor speaking about the piano. Specifically, she described the piano as the most complete instrument, and that it's the best one to make basic compositions on because it's so complete. And as you know, Halo 3 is supposed to be the ending to the original trilogy. What better way to compose a score for the ending to the trilogy than to put emphasis on the piano? It gives a full circle kind of vibe, and the chords played in the tracks, like the Warthog run, really create this kind of desperate finality that can only be achieved by the piano. Of course, I'm speaking out of my ass here. I don't really know anything about music, but it's fun to speculate. This level is the 7th level, and perhaps the longest level in the game. If it isn't, it's probably tied to the previous level for length. The length of this level makes for such a sweaty-ass run, bro. Towards the end, you'll see me play it more and more conservatively because I really didn't want to lose my progress. Of course, I ended up dying a couple times, but not as much as in that one level, the Storm. However, a couple deaths in this level came at really bad times, and I have some unfortunately funny deaths toward the tail end of the mission, which made me restart the whole damn level like twice. There was even a death I had which happened like not even 5 minutes before the end of the level, which made me really frustrated. I'll show you a clip of that part when we get to it. But getting back to the level, if you take a look at the surroundings, you'll notice that it's very green and serene, very reminiscent of that same kind of natural surroundings you found yourself in the second level of the very first Halo game. If I'm not mistaken, I think that Bungie modeled these kinds of environments after their home state of northern Washington. It's always interesting to me when creators of any kinds of media put some kind of characteristic from their homes into their work. It's also something that I've done myself, as evident of the Mafuti fish in my profile name. It's like no matter what a person does, they always want to add a piece of their home as part of their identity or a part of their work's identity. But that might just be bullshit. I'm pretty sure plenty of games have absolutely nothing to do with their developers' homes. The beginning part of this level is unfortunately a bit like Tsavo highways, where the only vehicles you're given access to aren't that reliable at all. However, that's mitigated quite a bit since you're given access to a weapon new to the Halo series called the Spartan Laser. The Spartan Laser is just absolutely insane. A single charged shot is enough to insta-kill any infantry unit even without headshotting them. And it will also basically insta-kill every vehicle in the sandbox except for phantoms, if you can even count them as a vehicle. It's one of my favorite weapons in the sandbox, but unfortunately there are only 2 levels where these are accessible. It hits as hard as a tank, correction, even harder than a tank, but it takes a while for the laser to charge up, around 4 seconds I believe. Additionally, you can only fire a total of 5 lasers with this thing, since each shot costs you around 20%. It's balanced so that you can't just go out into the middle of the battlefield and insta-kill 5 vehicles within 5 seconds. Despite how big and hulking and as barbaric as this weapon makes it seem, you actually have to use this weapon a bit more strategically than you think. To use it optimally, you can charge up the Spartan Laser a little bit first behind cover, and then pop out of cover for the last second or so. This makes it so that you'll minimize the damage taken, if any, and also it gives your enemies very little time to react. However, this also runs the risk of missing your target since you give yourself so little time to aim. In this part of the level, the player is given their first flying vehicle in the game, the Hornet, which also happens to be a new addition to the sandbox in Halo. I don't know if you heard that a little bit earlier, but I accidentally used my invincibility equipment, since my equipment button is mapped to the same button as the descend button for vehicles. If it were any other equipment, I wouldn't have used it when pressing the button, since in order to even use those other pieces of equipment, you had to have physically placed something on the battlefield. I ended up getting through the level just fine though, so it's not a big deal. It's just a problem with how I configured my controls. In the original game for the Xbox 360, you were only able to change your controls to a specific set of controls predefined for you, none of which had any overt conflicting controls like mine does right now. But being able to customize your controls to your liking is such a huge deal for comfort, especially in an action game like this, so I can't even complain. It's one of the few things 343 deserves some praise for, I think. But even then, button mapping and keybind customization is somewhat of a standard for a lot of games, so I take that back a little. This level is the only level in the game the player can pilot the Hornet. This is probably because the Hornet is so dang powerful, especially in wide open spaces like this where you can really take your time shooting from a distance. The Hornet has unlimited ammo from its forward-facing machine gun, and it also has unlimited rockets, which lock on and home into any enemy when your reticle is colored red. These 2 unlimited and very powerful types of ammo are devastating for any enemy. And plus, since you have access to nearly unrestricted movement in each plane, X, Y, and Z, you can strafe up and down or left and right, making you basically invincible if you're paying attention to the enemy projectiles. The Hornet is so dang strong that Bungie thought it was too powerful for Halo 3's multiplayer. It's absent from public multiplayer lobbies. You can spawn it in Forge maps and, by extension, custom games, but you'll never see it in sanctioned game modes, even in big team battle. Of course, I might be wrong about the MCC version of the game, but I specifically remember the Hornet not being around in the original. It's a little strange. It might just be the Mandela effect or something, but I do remember another flying vehicle called the Falcon being around in Halo Reach's public multiplayer lobbies, and that was also a powerful flying vehicle, so I wonder what in Bungie's design philosophy changed to make it this way. Earlier I mentioned that the missiles you shoot can lock onto and home toward their target if the reticle is colored red. In any other game, and even in some of the Halo games, you probably would see an indicator showing that you're locking on and hearing some kind of locking on sound effect. In Halo 3, that's never the case. I've always found lock-on sound effects to be a little bit annoying, especially in moments like these, where there are a ton of enemies you're able to lock onto. If there was a lock-on sound, you'd probably be hearing it beep, beep, beep non-stop in this section, so I think they did make the right decision here. Also, I would have called this section boring, since I'm basically in no danger at all right now, especially since I'm sitting back and taking my time killing enemies one by one, but this is really basically the only time in the game you get to do this, and the Hornet is so fun to use, so I'm not going to rant about this one. This level really showcases how diverse and varied Halo 3's sandbox can be. Besides games like GTA, which are games literally focused on making a huge open world simulation, I can't think of another game released at the time with campaigns that let you seamlessly transition back and forth between infantry-based combat, ground vehicle-based combat, and flying vehicle-based combat. This level also showcases just how huge feeling linear level design can be. So many AAA games past this point market their games as sprawling, huge open worlds, but when you actually go into those worlds, they just feel empty and devoid of content. Unfortunately, Halo isn't a stranger to this either, as Halo Infinite unfortunately fell for the open world meme. On paper, open worlds sound amazing. Who wouldn't want to go out into a vast open world adventure fighting enemies and making friends along the way? As much as I've tried to like open world games, I go into one each time thinking it'll be different, but it always ends up the same way, feeling like there's way too much boring walking and traversing, and way too little stimulating gameplay. At least in games like GTA, half of the game is about driving, so traversing the world is actually kind of fun, but I'm getting way off topic here. Maybe I'll save this rant for another video. You didn't get to hear it since I was yapping over it, but the objective behind this mission is that there are 3 towers assigned to Chief, Arbiter, and Johnson. When each of the towers are activated, that big force field gets deactivated, making ground insertion and aerial insertion in that next area possible. We took out ours in the beginning of the level, and the Arbiter took his out as well. Unfortunately, Johnson couldn't take his out. He faced too strong an opposition, and he got captured as a result. So since Chief and Arbiter have nothing better to do, they come over to Johnson's tower and clear it out. Johnson had it rough, man. He had to face 2 hunters, a ton of drones, a ton of brutes, and a bunch of invisible brutes, plus a chieftain on the top, which we'll see just a little bit later. I spoke about Johnson before all the way back in the first level, specifically about how he consistently gets held up or captured, in this case twice. And if you know the ending of the game, you might know how this can act as foreshadowing for later events. The fact that he gets captured twice creates some level of sympathy for his character, as he's basically just a guy without any crazy armor, without recharging shields like Chief and Arbiter is, yet he's looped up with and tasked with the same mission the Chief and Arbiter is as well. If we're talking lore-wise, technically Johnson is one of the very first Spartans ever created, but also, since we're talking lore-wise, Johnson is fucking old. He's like 70 or something. Just knowing his age adds another layer of sympathy for his character. Johnson is in many ways the personality and spirit of humanity, or the human faction in the game. Throughout the game, he displays humor, tenacity, and caring for his fellow man. Part of what being human is about in real life. Coincidentally, my Grandpa Schleem, is also around that age. Coincidentally, my grandpa also talks like a hard-ass a lot of the time, and coincidentally, my grandpa also happens to share the same rank as Johnson, as he retired from the military as a sergeant major. So it wouldn't be far-fetched for me to say that I do see a little bit of my grandpa in Sergeant Johnson, which makes part of the story a little bit hard for me to watch. If it weren't already obvious, this level is one of the most diverse and varied levels in all of Halo. We've had ground combat, aerial combat, and now the Flood is thrown into the mix. So now all of the factions in the entire game have converged into this one compact and fantastic level. There's one more brick thrown into the washing machine, which we'll see at the tail end of the mission, which I'll talk a little bit about when we get to it. One thing that I haven't really talked about is the way the campaign handles the player characters in multiplayer. If I'm not mistaken, you can play co-op campaign with up to 4 players. The first player plays as Master Chief, and the second player will play as the Arbiter. The third and fourth players, I believe, will be in the shoes of some of the Arbiter's followers. In previous games, they never made the extra effort to make the co-op experience more closely adhere to the canon. If there were 4 players in previous games, you would play as 4 Master Chiefs or 4 Arbiters. It doesn't really make a difference, it's just a nice little detail they added to make the game a bit more comfy to play with other players. Some players who like the Master Chief more might choose to play as Player 1. I used to play the Halo campaigns with one of my friends from elementary, and he always liked to play as the Arbiter since he thought he looked cool. This simple addition to the game can also add an ultimately insignificant level of decision making, but some decision making is better than none in my opinion. I suppose now that you're seeing it, it might be a good time to talk about it. Since I originally failed this mission twice, I got frustrated and took a break. I went back a couple days later to redo it, and before I started the mission, I checked an option box called Enable Campaign Customization. What this does is that it enables the weapon skins you've unlocked for multiplayer and puts it into the campaign. On one hand, I think it's fine to have some customization, especially for some things as inconsequential and as harmless as a camo weapon skin. I think it can help to add some level of replayability, as going back to replay the campaign while seeing skins you've unlocked is nice. But there are a couple problems I have with customization, both through the campaign and through the multiplayer. In order to unlock weapon or vehicle skins, you have to complete daily challenges which award you Spartan points, which are the currency used for unlocking weapon skins, vehicle skins, and more. The problem with this is that you didn't have to do this for the original Halo 3. In order to unlock certain armor pieces for multiplayer, you had to do certain things in the campaign. For example, in order to get the Hayabusa armor, you had to find all the skulls in the original, or to get the EOD armor, you had to beat the game on Legendary. Granted, the original Halo 3 didn't have nearly as much customizable options, and it didn't even have any vehicle or weapon skins. You might be saying, oh, boo-hoo, I don't have to jump through the hoops like you did, get over it. First of all, fuck you, and second of all, that's not the point. Although I don't agree with seasons or whatever, I personally like that 343 added some sort of progression system, just to keep things feeling a little fresh. But the point I'm trying to make is that this isn't a good representation of the original Halo 3. As much as I think the locations of the skulls are bullshit, I don't think this was the right choice to make. You can get the Hayabusa armor so much more easily now without going through the tribulations that you had to do in the original game. All you have to do is complete a couple challenges and then use the Spartan points you got to unlock the Hayabusa armor. As someone who advocates for games preservation, doing this feels a little bit like you're taking something from the past and molding it to make what you think should have been the case in the first place, which can come off as disrespectful to the original game. I think a suitable compromise would be to keep it as it is now, having unlockable weapon skins and whatnot through the Spartan point system, but still lock things like the EOD armor and the Hayabusa armor behind in-game achievements. Anyways, it's a small complaint, but small things add up. I suppose I should be thanking my lucky stars that players aren't able to purchase Spartan points through real-world currency. The unlocking system isn't the only complaint I have, though. I have another problem with customization I want to talk about briefly. Thankfully, it's not as bad as games like Call of Duty or even Halo Infinite, but some customization options in the game have the potential to clash with the in-game universe. In addition to things like weapon customization, there are also poses you can buy to customize how your character looks if someone opens up your gamertag at the end of the match or something. There are completely fine poses that can totally fit in the Halo universe, but then you get things like this. Take a look at this stupid yoga pose here, it's so fucking dumb. This doesn't mesh well at all in this sci-fi military shooter. Of course, in Halo Reach you get some customization options like Grunt Birthday Party, which makes the Grunt Birthday Party sound when you died, or Inclement Weather, which puts thunderclouds around your character. But at least those were very expensive and difficult to get, so you don't really see them often. Stuff like this yoga pose bothers me, because it's so easy to get. so many players can have access to it right off the bat. Having a lobby full of these yoga-posing Spartans would really harm my experience. And then you get the shit in Halo Infinite like cat ears and whatnot, which really hurts me to see, because I hold Halo on a pedestal. Cat ears and unicorn horns make it comparable to other games, which don't give a shit about making their customizable options cohesive to the in-universe art style. I know, these complaints I have are so inconsequential, especially in MCC, since things aren't nearly as bad in this game as it is in others. Plus, they make little to no impact on the gameplay, but like I said earlier, the little things really add up. Respect toward cohesion seems so minor and insignificant, but it can really go a long way, I think. Anyways, my boomer rant about this shit is done. I'll stop talking about it now. I might have soured the moment here, but this part is one of the coolest encounters in the game. You're tasked with killing not one, but 2 scarabs, which can be dispatched from the air with the extremely powerful Hornet. Let's watch it together!
Flood scales the Citadel's far wall. Activate this bridge oracle. The Prophet will die by my hands, not theirs.
Calamity! If only we had more time!
I don't really know how they did it, but there are 2 specific points in this game which have music that almost always end at just the right time. This part just now was one of them. I don't know what flags I triggered to end the song just before you enter the next building, or even if I triggered any flags at all, but every single time I play through this level, I swear it always ends at this exact point. If you happen to know what it is, please feel free to let me know, but I'll be quiet now since there's another cutscene coming up.
All who believe shall be saved.
Chief, how close are you?
Not close enough.
That the best you got? Oh, come on. Impress me. Stop! You imbecile! He wants you to kill him.
I'd prefer that you did not.
What's the matter, big shot? Can't start your own party?
I admit, I need your help. But that secret dies with all the rest.
Johnson, sound off.
Get out of here!
Not without you.
You delay the inevitable. One of you will light the rings. You cannot hope to kill them all.
You're right.
Do it. Me. Then you. Now. No! Your forefathers wisely set aside their compassion, steeled themselves for what needed to be done. I see now why they left you behind. You were weak, and gods must be strong.
Do not shoot, but listen. Let me lead you safely to our foe. Only you can halt what he has set in motion.
Fun fact, when I was a kid I skipped through this cutscene the second I got bored, and I got put immediately in this position where you see the Flood crawling all around you. I ended up killing most of the Flood, and I didn't have many allies to tank the aggro from the Fuel Rod grunts, so I just kept dying over and over on this part until I realized we were actually allied with the Flood. So yeah, this part is very unique. In no other Halo games does the Flood ever directly help you. They might help you indirectly by fighting your Covenant foes, but in the end, after they kill the Covenant, they'll just head straight for you right after. I suppose this whole sequence might be that same thing, but just on a greater scale, but you get what I mean. You've never actually seen the Flood turn green as your reticle hovers over them. That's how different this part is. It's a great moment because it shows how intelligent the Flood is. They're willing to ally with you, their enemy, to stop the Halo rings from firing. As cool as it is, though, I don't think this part makes for very satisfying gameplay, however. The bridge up ahead you're confined to is very, very narrow, and it doesn't give much room for strafing. Additionally, there isn't much verticality here either, so you can't really go up top or down below to get away from the firefight, so you're just stuck in this single lane. On top of all of that, on the platform ahead there are two grunts with fuel rod guns that fire constantly. All of this combined makes for a very oppressive firefight. The top priorities to get rid of this encounter are the fuel rod grunts, since a single blast from their fuel rods can insta-kill you, and there are also two of them, so they're doubly as dangerous. If you didn't bring a precision weapon with you beforehand, you'll have to pick them off much more slowly and inaccurately from afar with something like a spiker, which is really boring in my opinion. But it's what I have to do, since I am not risking the last 30 minutes to get up close to one of those assholes. Thankfully, the Flood takes most of the aggro, but it's still entirely possible I'll catch some stray bullets here and there. But the more I watch it, the more I really think it's boring to watch. I'll speed it up here and slow down when I see something I want to talk about. This room is a representation of the much, much bigger Halo array. Each of the holograms you see up here represent the installations currently in the universe. If you look closely, you'll see that there's something wrong with one of the Halos, as it's red on a couple sides. This must be the Halo ring that Master Chief destroyed in Halo 1. It's nothing crazy, but this small attention to detail is a very cool thing in my opinion, as it really cements your actions in previous games. It's kind of funny, you can tell how conservatively I'm playing right now. I was taking very little risks since I was sweating my balls off at this moment. It just goes to show how tension can really change the way the player thinks, and by extension how they act. Aside from stimuli in real life like board games or card games, or if someone held a gun to your head, video games are the only form of entertainment that can force you to change your mindset and actions based on circumstances like this.
stop the rings. Save the rest. Can you see, Arbiter? The moment of salvation is at hand.
It will not last.
Your kind never believed in the promise of the sacred ring.
Lies for the weak, beacons for the deluded.
I will have my revenge. On a prophet, not a plague.
My feet tread the path. I shall become a god.
You will be food, nothing more.
No! I am truth, the voice of the Covenant.
So, you must be silenced.
Now the gate has been unlatched, headstones pushed aside, corpses shift and offer room. A fate you must abide.
We trade one villain for another.
I can barely keep hold of her, Chief.
So, remember when I was talking about me dying in this level? Yeah, so this is one of the parts where I died. It's literally at the very end of the mission. Not even 5 minutes away from the end goal after all this damn time. I'll put up a clip now.
Keep hold of her, Chief. No way I can pick you up. Head back to the lift. Find a way down.
Very, very unfortunate, but it was ultimately my fault for being a cocky bastard jumping around everywhere. My landing on that last jump was cushioned by that single bit of geometry which just happened to be at the exact angle to push me off. If I wasn't jumping like a dumbass, that never would have happened. I still feel the sting of lost progression even by just watching this clip. Anyways, the last two cutscenes were certainly very, very juicy cutscenes, but I didn't have enough time to talk about them without overlapping my voice over them, because the gameplay segments were just too short in between each of them. I'll get to it later in the next level, but for now I'm just going to speed up the footage again because I'm just playing it really safe for this final segment. In fact, I'm playing it so safe that the Arbiter consistently gets way ahead of me, and normally friendly NPCs are always pretty far behind you. So it's just as boring, if not even more boring, than the first two times. While you wait, please enjoy this shitty cover I made on my old phone of Banana Man by Tally Hall.
On the plane, no banana make you go insane. Going back to busy town, no banana make you want to frown. Do you want a banana? You peel it back and go Do you want a banana? This banana for you.
What do you see?
replacement. The ring you destroyed.
When did you know?
Just now. But I had my hopes. What will you do?
Light it.
Then we are agreed. A tactical post will completely eradicate the local infestation. I will personally oversee the final preparations, though it will take time to fabricate.
How will you light it?
Chief, I'll round up our survivors, fall back to the dawn. Arbiter will do the same with the elites. Cortana's in there somewhere.
I didn't get the chance to speak about the last couple of cutscenes, but now that we have a long gameplay segment here, I have the chance now. The previous two cutscenes were in succession, probably the worst cutscene in the game, then followed by one of the best, which is kind of funny to think about. All the way back in the second mission, I mentioned that one of the reasons I think the storytelling is worse in Halo 3 than it is in Halo 2 is because they changed voice actors for no apparent reason publicly. In Halo 2, the Prophet of Truth was voiced by Michael Wincott, or Winkit, I don't know how to pronounce his name, an actor probably best known for his roles in The Crow and one of the Alien movies. I think he did a fantastic job in Halo 2. His smooth yet gravelly voice gave Truth a sort of manipulative edge, which is very fitting for a character whose whole shtick is about manipulating others to join his cult. But for some reason, they changed his voice actor in Halo 3 to Terrence Stamp. Don't get me wrong, Stamp is extremely talented in his own right, and his voice is very fitting and charismatic enough to play Truth convincingly. Just listening to his performance in the last two cutscenes is enough to confirm that. But changing someone who is already well established as the voice of someone as important as Truth is questionable to me. The Prophet of Truth plays a much larger and more central role in Halo 3, but his character has been flanderized a bit. He leans much more heavily on the messianic tone in this game, and he comes off as a bit more of a delusional, crazy Inquisition-type bastard, whereas in Halo 2, Michael Wincott's performance sort of gave Truth an underlying air of subterfuge, almost as if he himself didn't believe in the Great Journey, yet used it as an instrument to further his own selfish goals. Whether or not that's true in the first place doesn't ultimately matter. The important part is that Wincott's performance implies it, which in itself already adds a layer of depth to his character. I guess the casting director thought Stamp's authoritative British accent might have been chosen to better show off how much of a religious zealot he is, but if you ask me, a lot of Truth's character was lost by getting rid of Wincott. Anyways, that complaint I have about the Prophet of Truth is purely subjective. What's objectively bad about that cutscene is how fucking forced it is. Particularly the whole sequence where Miranda crashed in to save Johnson but gets herself killed in the process. Let's take a look at this cutscene again briefly, shall we?
Johnson, sound off.
Get out of here!
Not without you.
You delay the inevitable. One of you will light the rings. You cannot hope to kill them all.
You're right.
Do it. Me. Then you. Now. No! forefathers wisely set aside their compassion, steeled themselves for what needed to be done. I see now why they left you behind. You were weak, and gods.
No one even attempted to stop this little exchange while it was happening? That each of those battle-hardened monster apes somehow lost their guns in the process? You expect me to believe that those brutes guarding the literal leader of their entire military might are not armed to the teeth? You could argue that they were too dazed to take action more decisively, but come on, man. None of them even took enough damage to shatter their armor. They were just crip-walking like a bunch of zombies toward Miranda. Oh, and speaking of Miranda, what a dumbass. And Johnson too, for that matter. You're surrounded by enemies. You can't just be having this melodramatic conversation in the midst of these guys. What are you guys doing? Miranda didn't even have to come up here in the first place. Chief and Arby were on their way. And then Truth, out of all his highest ranked soldiers, was the one to shoot Miranda in the back. Come on now, what the hell?
And yet, perhaps a part of her remains.
This whole sequence was just bullshittery forced drama. It's not natural at all. This one cutscene is probably the epitome of Halo 3's worst writing. Nothing in Halo 2 was written as poorly as this, I think. I mean, when I first saw this cutscene, I was just a dumbass kid, but even I could tell some things were fucked in this cutscene. I understand that the game was trying to be more of a kind of dramatic finale, since it is the last installment in the original trilogy after all, but they just went way overboard with this cutscene here, and I think it should have been reworked. But one gameplay segment after that, we get one of the coolest cutscenes in the game. Arbiter's goal is finished, he killed Truth in such a satisfying way, and it was directed just so well, man, and written so well for that matter too. By the way, I do have a lot to say about Arby and the Chief's relationship, but I'll get to that later. While I'm on this topic, I'd also like to talk a little bit about Master Chief himself. His character in the game is just done so well in my opinion. In Halo 2 he was kind of given this bad boy vibe with all the cool one-liners, which was a departure from Halo 1 I think. In Halo 1, Master Chief wasn't this same cool bad boy he was in Halo 2, he was inquisitive and sincere. Of course, his lines could be interpreted as cool and bad boyish, especially since Steve Downes' voice is just really deep and cool sounding naturally. But he never went out of his way to say things for the sake of sounding cool. He basically only spoke in reply to someone else, to ask a question or to advance the conversation in some way. He would comfort a Marine by patting him on the chest, and he would even find himself in humorous situations with Cortana, like teleporting upside down and falling on his back, and Cortana would even call him a barbarian when he sincerely asked about how they could use the Halo rings against the Covenant. He was definitely painted as more of a human character in Halo 1. Of course he was badass in his own right, since he is the Master Chief after all, but his badassery was a side effect of his actions. Whereas in Halo 2, Chief is written almost like a force of nature. He had super cool lines like, "To give the Covenant back their bomb," or "I'd rather not piss this thing off," or "Boo," or "Sir, finishing this fight." All lines that overtly interpret as impressive or cool. The writers definitely wanted to give him a bad boy edge, and there's nothing really wrong with that since first of all it is cool and it does give Chief a little bit of personality. The problem is that Chief is almost only written this way. When you compare Chief in 1 to 2, it's almost as if they're different characters. It isn't that cohesive, and if you jumped directly into Halo 2 after Halo 1, the change in writing would be a bit jarring. In Halo 3, I think they wanted to rectify that a bit. He comes off as more stoic and serious than badass, which I think is a nice mix between 1 and 2. Of course, he still has overtly cool one-liners like, "Does he usually mention me?" but not as much as in Halo 2. He was given much less lines in this game than either of the first two games, but in some ways, I think he's more expressive. One thing that they really improved on with his character that isn't talked about too often is his body language. The animators really did a great job with Master Chief in this game. Conventional storytellers would have a difficult time with Chief because he's always wearing a helmet. Since Halo 3 is inherently the most emotional one out of the trilogy, you have to have him show some kind of emotion. So how do you have a character emote if he can't display facial expressions? You give him lines which explain how he's feeling. But that runs the risk of being too expositional and on the nose, which in turn can really take you out of the experience. Or, the second way is that you can display his emotions through body language. I think the animators had a really tough job, because it's so hard to convey emotion through the subtleties of human body language, especially with a mocap suit. But I think they really nailed it in my opinion. All of the animations were, as far as I know, done by hand, and so all of the animation in the game more resemble an animated Pixar movie than it does in real life. And if you're wondering where in the game Chief displayed emotion via body language, just go back to that section where he sees Miranda on the ground being cradled by Johnson. I implore you to go back to the cutscenes or even replay the game yourself, and pay close attention to Master Chief's body language. You might find some stuff you've never noticed before. I know I did. Let's get back to the level before I blow my load thinking about Master Chief. This is the 8th and penultimate mission in the game, which takes place in a flood-infested version of High Charity. I think this level is just an atmospheric goldmine. It's so great. In Halo 2, High Charity was only beginning to be infected, so the flood didn't have nearly as much of a grip on this place as it did before. But now we return, barely even a month after the events of Halo 2, and this place is just absolutely overrun. In some areas, you can't even tell if this place used to even belong to the Covenant, it's that bad. A quick look at the wiki shows that High Charity is roughly 348 kilometers in diameter, which in American translates to a little more than 216 miles in diameter.
Time has taught me patience, but basking in new freedom, I will know all that I possess!
This is fucking huge. That's like 1.5 times the width of the state of Indiana. So, judging by how tight some spaces are in this level, I wouldn't be surprised if a huge chunk of that 216 miles was nothing but just fleshy walls and floors and ceilings. This level also has quite the reputation for being very oppressive and difficult. I think there are a couple of reasons why that is. One, the environment. As I've described before, this atmospheric level is so beautifully evil and ugly to look at. The fleshy walls and floors and pulsating flood pod environmental hazards, it's really unsettling and really adds to that sense of unease, that you're surrounded by nothing but evil. This stuff extends to the level design. Most areas in this level are very tight, and there isn't much room to strafe past enemy projectiles. Visibility is obscured by such tight passageways, so even knowing where to go next can be a little bit daunting. 2. The NPC pool. Obviously, since you're in basically a flood base of operations, you're going to be facing flood. Lots and lots and lots of flood. The flood faction itself is diverse, thankfully. There's infection forms, combat forms, tank forms, pure forms, and carrier forms, which when combined make for interesting and varied combat scenarios. But the enemies are just so numerous and so oppressive that it really pins your back against the wall for much of the time, forcing you to stay in cover for quite a while. Also, if you're playing in single player like me, you won't have any allies at all in this mission to take any aggro off you. 3. Checkpoints. This level is known for having such ass checkpoints which knock you back way behind where you think they should have been. This isn't a problem for this playthrough specifically since we have the Iron Skull on, so checkpoints are irrelevant, but it should be noted as part of why I think this level is so tough. 4. Monotony. In each of the previous levels, there was much more variety in combat encounters and level design. There were some tight corridors, yes, but there were also open spaces for you to run around in. And there was vehicle combat, which there's none of this in the level, by the way. This level is just going from room to room, shooting a shit ton of Flood. The monotony of the gameplay can add to the sense of repetitiveness and boringness. Oh, and this level has a god-awful amount of these slowly walkie-talkie sections where either the Gravemind or Cortana speak to you for a couple of seconds. Personally, I have a soft spot for this kind of gameplay and atmosphere. I fucking love slow-paced atmospheric sections, which is why I really love games like Dark Souls and Half-Life 1 and some immersive sims, which are known for their slow, quiet gameplay, where decisions really matter. Halo doesn't have much decision-making past which enemy am I going to shoot next, but you get the point. The atmosphere really makes up for the monotonous gameplay in my opinion. That being said, this level just isn't that fun in my opinion. It's a great, dark experience, but it's just not that fun. You could argue that this level's difficulty sort of mimics the oppressive atmosphere of the story at this point, and I think I'd agree with that. It really shows you how horrible the Flood can be, and what mankind's future awaits if we don't stop the Flood.
I have walked the edge of the abyss. I have seen your future, and I have learned.
Submit! End her torment and my own!
And just how much Cortana has gone through. But you could also argue that Halo is all about fun, and not about these horrible, slow-paced, oppressive encounters. I don't know. I just don't know. Personally, I like this level, but I get why it's shat on so frequently. The numerous enemies, the tight hazardous spaces, and the general atmosphere of the level makes me play very cautiously, which I personally find satisfying, but it does unfortunately not make for good gameplay, at least to watch. I'll be speeding this part up just because I find this part and the next couple of parts just so boring. I believe I spoke briefly about the lore implications for why Cortana and Gravemind transmit comms and visions directly through Chief's brain, even without Cortana being present in Chief's neural network or whatever it's called. I tried to read up on this to figure out why they can even do this, but I couldn't wrap my brain around it. Something about Chief having access to the domain, being effectively a reincarnation of the Didact, or the Gravemind wanting to lure in Chief somehow or some shit. I don't know. I really don't know. These sequences in the game are really just unclear and fuzzy lore-wise. Feel free to correct me, but to me it's just space magic.
This is UNSCAI serial number CTN0452-9. I am a monument to all your sins.
Anyways, coming up here, we have probably by far my favorite cutscene in the entire game. I'll stop talking now just so we can watch it.
You found me. But so much of me is wrong. Out of place. You might be too late.
You know me. When I make a promise.
You keep it. I do know how to pick 'em.
Lucky me. Do you still have it?
The activation index from the first Halo ring. A little souvenir I hung on to, just in case. Got an escape plan?
Thought I'd try shooting my way out. Mix things up a little.
Just keep your head down. There's 2 of us in here now, remember?
I could gush about this for about a good hour, how much I love this cutscene, but I'll spare you from my insane ramblings. Mostly.
Now, at last I see! Her secret is revealed!
I really like this cutscene because it's so short. It's barely even a minute long, but it's so sweet, man. And it's directed so well, too. That brief moment of silence after you shatter the shield, which creates a small moment of suspense, hearing Cortana's real voice for the first time in the game, then being struck with those beautiful, familiar-sounding chords, oh man, it's so good. It's a reunion between two fan-favorite characters core to the franchise, but it's so subtle and so understated. There's no loud dialogue about any of the characters professing how much they missed one another. It's just Cortana thinking she's still seeing hallucinations from the Gravemind, but then snapping out of it after she hears Chief's voice, and then they get straight down to business, just like how they've always done since the very first game. The dialogue and the blocking and the choreography is just so good too, man. You could really tell Cortana was in pain for the past month or so she's been trapped in here. But then Chief kneels down and then gets to her level and utters his first lines to her in the entire game. And then you can see that she's beginning to realize that she's being saved. Her face lights up both figuratively and literally. Even if you've never played a previous Halo game, just the way the characters speak to each other is so revealing without being revealing, if you catch my drift. The two have been through thick and thin, but this kind of information couldn't be conveyed correctly if this cutscene was directed in any other way. The music and the intimate blocking says so much about their relationship without saying a single word, and their almost flirty dialogue itself reveals even more. They're inseparable, and now they're finally back together. It's such a good scene, man. I love it so much. I'm gonna spoil the moment here, but this part coming up, I don't know what the hell the Halo gods were thinking, but they really, really didn't want me to get through this part. Just watch this. Oh my god, it's such bullshit.
I'm looking for an alternate. Careful.
Yeah, unfortunate, right? Very unfortunate. But this wasn't the only time this happened. I went back a couple days later to try and redo this level without dying again, but then it happened again. I died to the exact same unforeseeable hazard in the same exact way.
Corridors beyond this point have collapsed. I'm looking for an alternate. Careful.
I considered going back and redoing this once again, but I was just so frustrated. I was like, man, you know what? I didn't die because of my actions. The game just straight up killed me for no reason. So I am not dealing with this bullshit. So I just ended up backing out, turning off the Iron Skull, turning on the Acrophobia Skull, and then flying straight through this garbage again. The game wants to cheese me, I'm gonna cheese it back. Fuck you, game. Sorry if you were looking forward to seeing me beat the level without dying, but I just got way too fed up with that BS. The good news is that this is the only part in the video I die and restart, so you and I will just have to be content with that.
We are aboard. Humans and elites. Will you not come with us, brother?
No. This is our fight. And I will see it finished.
Johnson, do you have the frigate?
Yes, ma'am. I'll land her as close to the control room as I can.
Safe is better than close, Sergeant Major.
Roger that. And ma'am, it's good to have you back.
Halo. It's so new, unfinished. I'm not exactly sure what will happen when we fire it.
We'll head for the portal. And we'll all go home.
This is it. This is the final mission in the game. This is where we blow up a Halo ring once again, but this time we take out the Flood, if not for good, then at least to take them out of commission for a long while. Unlike most previous missions, the Arbiter will accompany us throughout the entire thing. Now that he's here the whole time, it reminds me to talk about him. I can't believe I haven't talked about it until now, but the way they handled the Arbiter in the game was just outstanding. I think his relationship with Master Chief was just handled so dang well, man. They're two battle-hardened, experienced warriors who develop a mutual respect for one another and share the same goal of defeating Truth and the Flood in the hopes of helping their own people. Their chemistry is quiet, understated, and subtle. Something I think is pretty rare, especially in AAA video games, with two main protagonists especially. In other games, or other mediums with narratives for that matter, relationships like this don't come too often. Normally, two bros like this will have some kind of scene together where they monologue one after the other about some trauma in the past or something else they could bond over. This doesn't happen with RB and the Chief. In fact, only once in the entire game does Chief ever say a single word of dialogue to the Arbiter. Let me repeat that. Chief only says one line of dialogue to RB throughout the entire game. I actually went back and counted. That "when did you know" line by Chief didn't count since that was directed towards Guilty Spark. And yet, even though they have basically no conversations, their relationship as bros still feels as believable as it could be in real life. And why is that? Because the two share common enemies, and the more pressure you see them put under, the more you see them work together. In the very beginning of the game, the two are allies, but that's with an asterisk. Chief doesn't know they've allied yet, so he shoves a magnum up to the Arbiter's throat. And you could, really tell he wanted to pull the trigger just because of his body language. And you could also tell that the Arbiter, in some small way, still feels some resentment towards Master Chief for what he did to him in Halo 1, when he delivers the line, "Were it so easy." Which was such a fantastic line, by the way. Soon, the Arbiter shows his true colors, his sincerity in working with and helping the humans. Chief observes this and treats him like any other ally after this. It's fantastic. There doesn't need to be any dramatic, "let's set aside our differences, bro" moment, because that would have just cheapened the writing. It's concise, simple, and like I said before, quiet, understated, and subtle. I love it so much. They're my favorite bromance in any story ever, hands down. I'll put up a quick clip of it, but back in the beginning of the level, I picked up another skull. I also can't believe I haven't talked about this yet either, but there's a challenge in these games called Lasso, which stands for Legendary All Skulls On. This is probably one of the most difficult challenges in Halo history, if not the most difficult challenge in the entire franchise. I spoke before about Legendary difficulty, specifically about how poorly it's balanced and how overly difficult it is, but when you're faced with the Lasso challenge, Legendary alone just becomes a joke in comparison. Each of the games have different skulls, but the core difficulty skulls are more or less the same, which are the ones I'll be talking about.
I got you covered, Chief.
So you're already familiar with the Iron Skull. The skull makes it so that when you die, you don't restart from a checkpoint, but rather the beginning of the level. This alone is kind of a brutal skull, but then you also have things like Black Eye, which makes it so that you can only regenerate shields by meleeing enemies. Legendary on its own makes it super difficult to get up close to enemies since you die so fast. But then this Black Eye stuff is just nuts, since if you get shot from far away and your shields go down, you're done. Then there's Fog and that other skull that literally just removes every single HUD element, including your gun, which is kind of funny to look at, but also stupid and frustrating to play with. Then there's skulls that modify the way AI acts, making them more aggressively shoot and throw grenades or more often dodge out of the way. Then there are skulls that change the way damage works, like increasing or decreasing enemy resistances and whatnot. And finally, there's the Cowbell Skull, which just increases explosion radii by a certain amount. So if you thought Legendary on its own was bad, Lasso is just absolutely bonkers. I give massive props to the mad lads who've completed solo Lasso runs. I've personally only completed a couple Lasso levels across the games, but they were the very first levels, which are the easiest ones. Even doing that was just a horrible fucking slog. I can't even imagine the amount of patience and dedication it takes to do the actual hard levels. And, while we're talking about things I can't believe I haven't talked about yet, equipment. That's right, I'm getting all this shit out of the way at the last minute. The equipment pieces in Halo 3 are excellent dynamic inclusions to the already superb sandbox in the game. They're new to the series, and I kind of can't believe they haven't been staples of the series in any games moving forward besides the most recent Halo game, Halo Infinite. There are 11 unique pieces of equipment in the game, some of which are more useful than others, but I'm still glad the less useful ones made it into the game because they still have their place in the sandbox. Heh. Bet you didn't see this coming. That's right. It's time for the objectively true Halo 3 equipment tier list, baby. Let's get started. Regenerator. A tier, starting off strong. It regenerates your shields instantly when placed, so it's good to use in the middle of a firefight. If you get scared, you're gonna get chopped to pieces. Downsides? It won't save you from getting sniped in the head, or if a single explosive projectile like a rocket or fuel rod makes contact with you, cause it'll just blow you up instantly. I'm not going to count this towards its score since this is more of a multiplayer problem than a campaign problem, but since the regenerator is neutral, it can also heal enemies. The regenerator is common, but not as common as some other equipment like the bubble shield. Oh, and also the regenerator is vulnerable to getting destroyed if you leave it out in the open, so you have to be slightly strategic about where you place it. Invincibility. I want to put this in S tier since, you're literally invulnerable to all forms of damage besides falling off a cliff or something, which is extremely useful in a firefight. It's not neutral either, so this effect only happens to the player that activates it. It's super strong when you use it. The problem is that it's not very common. It's very uncommon, in fact. You actually have to kill a brute chieftain without triggering its invincibility in order to even get a drop. If I were to put this on the tier list, I'd have to put it in either high B or low A. Let's go with low A. It's too strong to put it in B tier. Power Drain. Very solid piece of equipment. It's kind of common too. When thrown, it absolutely shreds shields in an area of effect, making follow-ups with headshots very easy. It also has the ability to EMP vehicles, so if you don't have a plasma pistol handy, the power drain will do the job. Just a worse job since it doesn't home into its target and the range isn't nearly as far. Downsides? It has a really deceptively big area of effect, so placing it in tight spaces can be pretty tricky. You can easily get your own shield shredded by your very own power drain, so you have to be strategic about where you place it. I'm giving the power drain an A tier. Oh, hang on. We gotta stop this real quick. There's a particularly important cutscene coming up. Let's just put this aside for now.
Yank me, Chief.
I'm not gonna lose her, too.
Oh, hello. Wonderful news. The installation is almost complete.
Terrific.
Yes, isn't it? I have begun my simulations. No promises, but initial results indicate this facility should be ready to fire in just a few more days.
We don't have a few more days.
But a premature firing will destroy the Ark.
Deal with it.
Will destroy this installation. Unacceptable! Unacceptable! Absolutely unacceptable! Protocol dictates action! I see now that helping you was wrong! You are the child of my makers, inheritor of all they left behind. You are Forerunner. But this ring is mine. I take no pleasure in doing what must be done. You do not deserve this ring. I have kept it safe. It belongs to me.
Not for long. Kick his ass.
My eye! Do you mean to blind me? Never.
I'm getting you out of here.
No, you're not. Don't let her go. Don't ever let her go. Send me out with a bang.
Chief, I'm so sorry.
Okay, back to the tier list. Just joking, that last sequence was kinda sad, right? I actually don't have too much to say about it. Like, it felt almost as forced as the whole Miranda sequence. Like, first of all, Chief should have been the one to go up to the control panel in the first place, just like he did in Halo 1. But for some reason, the writers just decided that Johnson should have been the guy to do it instead of Chief. I think this subpar writing was mitigated a bit because something tragic happening to Johnson was foreshadowed somewhat well, and Guilty Spark betraying us again at least had that one part in a previous level which foreshadowed that a bit too. It was directed pretty well, but I can't praise it too much either. Of course, I'm sad that Johnson died, and I'm sure that many other fans of the character are sad about that too. But the writing leading up to it just didn't feel that natural, and neither did it feel too shocking either. It's sad, but ultimately meh. It would have been more tragic if Johnson played a much bigger role in the game, but he was just getting into trouble and getting captured left and right, and he didn't really contribute that much to the plot either, besides finding the chief in the beginning of the game. It's just kind of disappointing to me, more than sad, to be honest. Anyways, let's finish up this tier list before we get to the final gameplay sequence of the game. Flare. Oof. Kinda cringe if you ask me. It's common in the first like 2 levels, but quickly becomes scarce the further you get into the campaign. It's really not very useful at all, at least in the campaign, since enemies don't even react to it, I don't think. I remember still dying at least a couple of times placing this boy out, and plus, since it's neutral, it still affects you. As soon as you throw it out, it effectively makes you blind. D tier. Sorry, Flare enjoyers, you're out of luck. Radar Jammer. God damn, we got 2 steaming piles of shit, one after the other. Effectively useless in campaign, since as far as I know, enemies don't even have radars. They still react to you in the same way they always do when they see you, which is to shoot on sight. The only person you're harming is yourself. Since it's a neutral piece of equipment, your radar will also get jammed. Low D tier, a pile of trash. I don't even think there are radar jammer enjoyers, so I'm not even gonna apologize. Bubble shield. Now we're getting somewhere. S tier, right off the bat. Best equipment in the entire game in my opinion. It's extremely common since those higher ranked blue brutes have it seemingly all the time. Very useful in a pinch. Taking too much damage? Drop it. It takes effect instantly. Stops all projectiles from coming into or out of the bubble. It also acts as a see-through cover, making it very easy to keep your crosshair right on target, giving the opportunity to pop out of cover immediately, dealing damage to your enemy. Even if enemies use the bubble shield, it doesn't mean shit, since most brute enemies in Halo 3 don't even have recharging shields. This basically gives you a small pocket of isolation for you to melee the enemy to death without taking damage from other enemies. It also lasts for a very long time, long enough to last you most combat encounters. Excellent piece of equipment. Next, Gravity Lift. Ooh, not too sure about this one. When you jump into it, the Grav Lift increases your height by a ton. This can give you a ton of extra verticality to have a very advantageous view of the battlefield, which can be very helpful. It also can help you to jump onto platforms you otherwise wouldn't have been able to. It can act as a grenade jump or even further your grenade jump to make your jump even higher than you normally would with a normal grenade jump. It also has some defensive capabilities. You can place it under some lighter enemy vehicles to disorient them by launching them into the air, and it also might make their vehicle flip over when they land, dismounting them. That being said, when you're using this, you're still entirely vulnerable to damage, if not even more vulnerable, since you're very visible jumping up into the air so high. I have seen clips of absolute madmen using this to get crazy no-scopes from super high up, but I'm not really counting the multiplayer aspect for this tier list. You barely even see this in the campaign. In fact, I've only used the Grav Lift twice in this entire video. The Grav Lift is too niche for me to put it any higher than a C. Therefore, it goes into C tier. Active Camo. You can use the active camo to get the drop on the enemy, or even by sneaking past enemy encounters altogether. But that being said, getting the drop on the enemy isn't even that good in this game, since once you fire your weapon, enemies will see you instantly right after. So if you're in the middle of a ton of unaware enemies, the second you assassinate a brute or something, you still have to deal with the rest of them the normal way. Also, I don't even remember seeing a single one of these things throughout my entire playthrough. I might just be wrong though. C tier. Just because using it is a net advantage. And it doesn't hinder you really in any way, but it's not really all that useful either. Trip mine? I don't have much experience with this one. I've actually only seen it once in the entire campaign, which is in Tsavo Highway. But even then, the wide open space in the entire level makes it super easy for enemies just to walk around it. I guess you can place it nearby enemies, and if they walk kinda close you could shoot it to make it explode, but you could also just kinda throw a grenade too for the same effect. Not all that useful in my opinion, and the area the explosion covers isn't all that big either. C tier. Auto turret. This one sucks. On paper it seems really cool to have an NPC shooting for you and taking some aggro, but it's way too weak both defense-wise and offense-wise. It shoots peas and has the health of a marshmallow. Also, I've literally only seen this once in the entire campaign, which happens to be on this level, D tier. Deployable cover. This one is just a worse bubble shield. A much worse bubble shield. It gets destroyed way too quickly, and it doesn't even completely surround you in cover like the bubble shield does. It can save you from like 5 plasma rounds, but after that shit, you're SOL again. It has the potential to be higher on the list if it were much more common than a bubble shield, but it doesn't even have that going for it. The bubble shield seems much more common than the deployable cover, C tier. Alright, the tier list is done. Let me go over it again and see if I agree with what I put. Yep, that seems about right. I probably would have put the grav lift a little higher though, just for the sake of having something on the B tier. I'll put it in B tier. And yeah, I think that's good with me. I've made an ass of myself by talking over one of the coolest gameplay segments in the game, which is Halo 3's version of a Warthog run, so I'll shut my mouth now. I'll see you on the other side.
Firing sequence initiated. Got it, Chief. Jump! Floor it right into the hangar. Hang on! Chief!
We'll make it.
It's been an honor serving with you, Jack.
For us, the storm has passed. The war is over. But let us never forget those who journeyed into the howling dark and did not return. For their decision required courage beyond measure, sacrifice, and unshakable conviction that their fight, our fight, was elsewhere. As we start to rebuild, this hillside will remain barren, a memorial to heroes fallen. They ennobled all of us,
and they shall not be forgotten.
Present! Hop!
I remember how this war started, what your kind did to mine. I can't forgive you. But you have my thanks for standing by him to the end. Hard to believe he's dead.
Were it so easy.
Things look different without the Prophet's lies clouding my vision. I would like to see our own world, to know that it is safe.
Fear not, for we have made it so.
By your word, Arbiter.
Take us home.
Chief? Can you hear me? I thought I'd lost you too.
What happened?
I'm not sure. When Halo fired, it shook itself to pieces. Did a number on the Ark. The portal couldn't sustain itself. We made it through just as it collapsed. Oh, some of us made it. You did it. Truth and the Covenant, the Flood, it's finished.
It's finished.
I'll drop a beacon, but it'll be a while before anyone finds us. Years, even. I'll miss you.
Wake me when you need me.
What a beautiful, quiet ending. If you ask me, the cutscene ending on the slow zoom into 117 should have been where Master Chief's story ended, but, you know, you always gotta leave it open for the inevitable sequel, am I right? Anyways, the epilogue sequence where Chief goes to sleep is also an acceptable, serviceable ending. I might even call it beautiful. But whatever. This video was such a huge undertaking for me, man. I've never done anything quite like this. I wrote like 20,000 pages of this shit, which is something I never thought I'd do. Halo 3 is one of my favorite games of all time. and I'm so happy to have shared my thoughts like this. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.